Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I first noticed the wet stone a little after 11 because I had already wiped that headstone down earlier in the evening. I worked maintenance at a cemetery outside Lincoln, mostly mowing, trimming, repairing small sections of fencing, and dealing with anything the council did not want to call somebody else for. During summer, I sometimes stayed late if the weather was cooler after dark. That week had been unusually dry. We had gone nearly 2 weeks without rain, and the grass had started turning yellow around the older graves. That night was warm and completely still. No mist, no dew, no wind. The temperature had stayed above 20 degrees even after sunset. I had been working near the western boundary, replacing a broken sprinkler head beside a row of newer graves. The cemetery closed to visitors at 9, and by 11 I was the only person inside. The first headstone belonged to a woman named Kathleen Drew. I remembered it because I had brushed grass clippings off the base earlier. When I passed it again, the front of the stone was wet. Not damp. Wet. Small beads of moisture covered the polished granite from top to bottom. Some had joined into narrow runs that reached the lettering. I stopped and touched it. The stone was cold enough that I pulled my hand away. That was strange on its own. Every other stone around it still held the heat from the day. The black granite ones especially were warm. I touched the grave beside it, warm and dry. Then the next. Dry. I assumed the irrigation line had sprayed farther than it should have, but the sprinkler was still disconnected. I had the replacement parts sitting beside my toolbox. I looked at the ground around Kathleen Drew's grave. Dusty soil, dry grass, no water. I wiped part of the headstone with my sleeve. Within maybe 20 seconds, tiny droplets began forming again. I actually laughed when I saw it because I thought I had found some odd condensation problem. I had spent enough time around stone to know it could hold different temperatures depending on shade, thickness, and material. Then, the headstone 2 plots over started doing the same thing. I watched it happen. The stone was pale gray granite, dry when I first looked. A dark patch formed near the top right corner, no bigger than my thumb. It spread downward and sideways until the whole front face had a thin shine on it. I checked my phone. 11:07 p.m. I took a photo. By the time I lowered the phone, another stone farther down the row had begun to darken. The wetness was moving. That was the part I could not explain. It did not spread to the nearest grave each time. It seemed to follow a straight line at an angle through the cemetery, crossing from one row into another. One headstone became wet. Then, 30 or 40 seconds later, another several meters away did the same. I stood there watching 4 of them in sequence. Each one went through the same pattern. A small patch of moisture appeared near the top, spread across the face, then collected into droplets. None of the grass got wet. None of the flowers got wet. Only the stones. I got my flashlight and started following the line. The cemetery was old enough that the layout changed depending on which section you were in. The newer part had neat rows. The Victorian section farther east was crowded and uneven with leaning stones and narrow paths. The condensation crossed directly toward that older section. I called my supervisor, Graham Mercer. He did not answer. I sent him a message saying something was wrong with the irrigation system, which was not really true, but I did not know how else to describe it without sounding stupid. The next wet stone was about 20 meters ahead. I reached it just as the moisture appeared. This one was limestone, rough instead of polished. The surface darkened from pale cream to gray in a narrow vertical strip. I put the back of my hand against it. Cold again. Not cool. Cold. I had a small infrared thermometer in the maintenance shed. I went back for it, which took maybe 4 minutes. When I returned, all the stones that had become wet were dry again. Every one of them. Kathleen Drew's headstone was warm. There were no watermarks. For a minute I wondered whether I had imagined the whole sequence because I was tired and overheated. Then I saw another stone darken farther east. I checked the temperature. The dry part read 21.6 degrees. The wet section read 8.3. I checked twice. The reading stayed around 8 degrees. The air around it was 21. I stepped away. The next stone along the same line began to sweat. The temperature there dropped while I watched it. 19, 15, 11, 9. Then the moisture appeared. I took a video. I said the time and location out loud while recording because I wanted something clear to show Graham in the morning. The line continued toward the center of the cemetery. I followed it with the thermometer in one hand and the flashlight in the other. By then I felt uncomfortable being there alone, which was unusual for me. I had worked nights in that cemetery dozens of times. Dead people had never bothered me. Foxes, teenagers, and loose dogs had caused far more trouble than anything else. What bothered me was the regularity. Something seemed to be moving at a steady pace, not fast, about walking speed. Each stone cooled, gathered moisture, then slowly warmed again after whatever it was had passed. I started timing it, 32 seconds between one stone and the next, then 34, then 31. The distance varied, but the overall movement stayed almost constant. The line crossed a gravel path. Nothing happened to the gravel. It crossed a wooden bench. The center slat developed a strip of condensation. I touched it. The wood was cold and wet in a band about 20 centimeters wide. The rest of the bench was warm. That was when I stopped thinking it had anything to do with the headstones. I walked backward a few steps and aimed my flashlight along the route the wetness had taken. There was nothing there, no fog, no insects, no visible movement. Then I heard a sound. It was very faint, a kind of soft ticking. Not mechanical exactly, more like small pieces of metal cooling after being heated. Tick, pause, tick, pause. It seemed to come from somewhere ahead of me. I switched off the flashlight. The cemetery became much darker than I expected. There were streetlights outside the boundary, but the trees blocked most of them. The sky was clear enough to see stars between the branches. The ticking continued. Then one of the solar memorial lights near the path went out. Another followed. Then another. They went dark in the same direction as the condensation. One at a time, I switched my flashlight back on. The beam flickered. I slapped the side of it, and it brightened again. Ahead of me, a polished black headstone turned cloudy with moisture. I moved toward it. The next one was an old marble cross. A thin white coating formed over one side. Frost. I touched it with the thermometer, 3.1 degrees. The air was still above 20. I backed away so quickly I stepped into a flower border. At that point, I decided I was done. I turned toward the maintenance building, planning to lock up and leave. My phone rang. The screen showed Graham's name. I answered immediately. "Did you call me?" he asked. "I messaged you." "What's happened?" I tried to explain. There was a long silence. "You've got water on the stones?" "Condensation, but they're freezing cold." "It's 20 degrees out." "I know." "Which section?" I told him. He said he would drive over. While we spoke, I heard that ticking sound again, closer this time. I stopped walking. "What?" Graham asked. "Nothing." The call became noisy. His voice broke into little pieces of static. Then underneath it, I heard another sound. 3 low tones. They were quiet but very clear. One tone, a slightly higher one. Then another above that. They repeated in the same order. Low, middle, high. Graham kept talking, but his voice sounded far away. I asked if he could hear the tones. What tones? The call disconnected. My phone still showed full signal. I tried calling him back. The screen froze for several seconds, then returned to the home screen. The ticking had stopped. I stood between 2 rows of graves, listening to absolutely nothing. Even the normal road noise from outside the cemetery seemed to have disappeared. Then condensation formed on the headstone beside me. I was standing directly in the path. The temperature around my legs dropped. It happened so suddenly that I saw my breath. I stepped sideways. The cold moved past me. That is the only way I can describe it. There was no wind, but I felt a narrow area of cold air continue forward at about the speed of a person walking. The grass did not move. My shirt did not move. Still, the cold passed. The next stone ahead darkened with moisture. Then, the next. I stayed several meters to the side and followed. I know that probably sounds like a stupid decision, but I wanted to see where it ended. Graham was on his way, and I had already been following it for 15 minutes. The line entered the oldest part of the cemetery. The graves there dated back to the 1800s. Some stones had sunk almost completely into the ground. Others leaned against each other. The path of condensation did not change for anything. It crossed a low brick wall. A narrow strip of bricks became wet and cold. It crossed an iron railing. 3 vertical bars turned white with frost. Then it continued on the other side. That bothered me more than anything I had seen so far. There was no gap in the wall at that point. Whatever cold area I was tracking seemed unaffected by solid objects. I started recording again. My phone camera would not focus properly. The image kept pulsing between sharp and blurry. I aimed at one of the wet stones and said, "This one just changed." On the screen, something moved behind it. I lowered the phone immediately. Nothing was there. I raised it again. A narrow, dark shape stood between 2 trees about 20 meters away. I lowered the phone. The space was empty. Through the camera, the shape returned. It did not look like a person. It was too thin and too uniform. It might have been a shadow from a tree trunk, except the angle was wrong. I took 2 steps left. The shape stayed in the same place on the screen. The next headstone cooled. The dark shape disappeared. My phone battery dropped from 58% to 12. I put it in my pocket. The condensation line reached the final section near the eastern boundary. Beyond that was a row of tall conifers and then open farmland. The graves there were mostly newer, with polished granite stones facing west. One by one, they became wet. I counted them. 6, 7, 8. The cold moved in a perfectly straight line. The last grave belonged to a man named Peter Walcott. His headstone was taller than the others, dark red granite with a small metal vase fixed to the base. Moisture formed at the top. The vase began making a faint rattling sound. I stopped about 10 meters away. The temperature around the grave dropped hard enough that frost spread across the metal base. Then the movement stopped. No new stone changed. The line had reached the end of the cemetery. The farmland beyond was open and flat. I stood there waiting. The silence became strange again. I could hear my own breathing and the soft buzz from a streetlight somewhere behind the trees. Then I noticed 3 lights above the last row. They were dim enough that I almost missed them. 3 pale points arranged vertically, one above another. They hung low over the field, maybe 30 or 40 meters above the ground. It was difficult to judge the distance because there was nothing directly behind them. At first I thought I was looking at stars through a gap in the trees. Then the lowest light moved sideways. The other 2 followed. They remained perfectly aligned. There was no flashing, no red or green aircraft lights, no engine noise. They moved slowly along the cemetery boundary and stopped above the conifers. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Another call from Graham. I answered without taking my eyes off the lights. "I'm at the gate," he said. "Where are you?" "Eastern side." "What am I looking for?" I told him about the lights. He said, "I don't see anything. They're above the trees." "I'm looking at the trees." The middle light brightened slightly. The cold area around the last grave disappeared. I felt warm air return around me. Condensation began evaporating from the stone. The 3 lights rose. Not quickly. They just moved upward together, keeping the same spacing. A low sound passed over the cemetery. It reminded me of a large truck idling very far away, except I felt it more than heard it. Graham said my name. I answered. The lights dimmed. For a second, all 3 became narrow, horizontal marks. Then they vanished. The normal sounds returned almost immediately. Cars on the road, insects in the grass, a dog barking somewhere across the fields. Graham found me a few minutes later. He had parked at the main gate and walked across with a torch. I showed him the last headstone. It was dry and warm. The frost on the vase had melted. I showed him my videos. The first recording worked normally. It showed moisture appearing on a headstone and the thermometer reading dropping. The second video had no image. The screen was black for the entire recording. The audio worked. My voice could be heard describing the wet stones. Underneath it was the ticking. Near the end, just before I stopped recording, 3 tones sounded. Low, middle, high. Graham listened twice. He did not say anything for a while. We walked the line back toward the maintenance building. Some of the stones had faint watermarks, but most looked completely normal. At the brick wall, 3 iron bars were still cold. The thermometer showed 7 degrees. Everything around them was 19. We left just after midnight. I drove home to a village about 15 minutes away. Graham followed me most of the way because he said my brake lights looked strange, and he wanted to make sure I got back. When I pulled into my driveway, he flashed his lights and continued home. My wife, Rebecca, was asleep. I locked the back door, checked the windows, and left my work clothes in the utility room. Before going upstairs, I noticed my boots. The left one was wet, only the toe. Small droplets of condensation covered the leather. The right boot was completely dry. I took the infrared thermometer out of my work bag. The wet boot measured 6.8 degrees. The dry one measured 21. I left both boots in the utility room and shut the door. At about 2 in the morning, I woke because something downstairs made a faint ticking sound. I stayed in bed and listened. Tick, pause, tick, pause. It continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. In the morning, the boots were dry and both were the same temperature. There were 3 narrow, wet marks on the inside of the utility room window. They ran vertically down the glass, one above the other. We noticed the lights over the hill because my brother-in-law thought they were stars. It was the 3rd night of a week we had booked in Northumberland, in a holiday cottage outside Rothbury. The place was an old converted farm building about 10 minutes from the village, surrounded by fields and low hills. There were 4 adults and 2 kids with us. Me and my wife, Hannah, her brother Louis and his wife, Imogen, and our daughters, Sophie and Erin. It had rained on and off all day. By evening, the clouds had broken in places, but there was still a low gray layer moving in from the west. The forecast said more rain overnight. We had eaten late, put the kids to bed, and were sitting in the kitchen with the back door open because the cottage had got too warm. Louis was the first person to point them out. He said, "Look at those stars." I turned around. There was a hill behind the cottage, maybe half a mile away. Not a mountain, just a long, dark rise with grazing fields on one side and thicker trees near the top. Above the ridge were 6 or 7 white points. They were unusually bright. At first, I agreed with him. They looked like stars. What was odd was how clear they were. The rest of the sky was hazy. You could see a few real stars through breaks in the cloud, but they looked soft and distant. These points were sharp, almost too sharp, like little LEDs. Imogen said they might be lights from a farm on the other side of the hill. Louis said no, because they were above the ridge. We stood in the doorway looking at them. Nothing moved. There were 7, as far as I could tell. They formed a loose curve, not a perfect line. One was much brighter than the others. I went outside. The grass was wet and the air smelled like rain. From the garden, I could see the whole ridge better. The lights definitely seemed to be in the sky. I asked Hannah if the cottage had binoculars. She reminded me that I had brought mine. I kept a small pair in the car for walking trips. I got them. By the time I came back, Louis had counted 8 lights. I looked without binoculars. I could only see 7. He pointed toward the left side of the ridge. There was another faint one. I raised the binoculars. For the first couple of seconds, I couldn't find them because I had the focus set wrong. Then they snapped into view. That was when I stopped thinking they were stars. There was cloud behind them, not in front, behind. I lowered the binoculars and looked again with my eyes. They still looked exactly like stars. I checked through the lenses again. A thin strip of cloud was moving across the sky from right to left. I could see it pass behind the white points. The lights didn't dim. I said, "They're below the cloud." Louis asked what I meant. I handed him the binoculars. He looked for maybe 10 seconds. Then he said, "Oh." That one word changed the mood immediately. Imogen took the binoculars next. She asked if there were pylons up there. There weren't. We had walked that hill the day before. There was a public footpath running along the lower slope and a stone wall near the top. No masts, no wind turbines, no tall buildings. Hannah said, maybe drones. That made sense at first. People flew drones everywhere, but the lights weren't moving. Not even a little. And there was no blinking. No red or green navigation lights, just steady white points. Louis said they might be much farther away than they looked. I checked through the binoculars again. The cloud layer made that difficult to believe. The points were clearly in front of it. I could actually see a faint glow around 2 of them when mist passed behind. That made them seem closer. Maybe over the hill, maybe just beyond it. I remember getting the uncomfortable feeling that I had judged the distance completely wrong. The brightest light seemed only a few hundred meters away. That couldn't be right. We stood outside watching for about 5 minutes. Nothing happened. Then one of the lights went out. No fading. It was there, and then it wasn't. Lewis said, "Did you see that?" We all had. A few seconds later, it came back. Same position. Then another one went out on the opposite side. It stayed off. Hannah said maybe cloud had covered it, but the cloud was behind them. I checked again through the binoculars. 6 lights now. The blank spot where the 7th had been was just dark sky. One of the remaining points seemed lower than before. I wasn't certain. There was nothing to compare it with except the ridge. I took my phone out and tried getting a picture. The camera made everything useless. Black hill, gray sky, tiny white dots. I switched to video. On the screen, the lights looked dimmer and started pulsing because of the camera exposure. In person, they were steady. Lewis walked farther into the garden. I followed him. There was an old wire fence at the bottom, and then a field sloping toward the hill. Some sheep were gathered near the far wall. They had been scattered earlier that evening. Now they were all standing in one group. Every one of them was facing uphill. I mentioned it. Lewis said sheep did weird things. That was true. Still, we both kept looking at them. None were grazing. They were just standing there. The kids were asleep upstairs, so we were trying not to talk too loudly. That made the whole thing feel stranger. The cottage behind us was bright and warm, and 20 yards away, everything was black and wet. Another light went out. 5. This time Imogen said, "That's deliberate." Hannah asked what she meant. She said they weren't being covered. They were switching off. Lewis laughed, but he didn't sound amused. He said, "By who?" Nobody answered. We went back inside for a while. That probably sounds strange, but there was nothing else to do. We weren't going to walk across wet fields in the dark to investigate lights on a hill. I shut the back door. We left the curtains open. From the kitchen table, we could still see them. 5 white points above the ridge. I made tea. Lewis checked an astronomy app on his phone. There should have been several stars in that part of the sky, but the cloud made the comparison pointless. He held the phone up and tried lining things up. The lights didn't match any obvious pattern. Then his compass started behaving strangely. The phone kept rotating the sky map even though he was holding it still. He recalibrated it. Same thing. I told him phones did that indoors. He stepped outside. The map spun once, stopped, then shifted about 30 degrees. He came back in and put the phone down. We didn't talk about it. Around 11, a car came along the road in front of the cottage. Its headlights briefly lit the hedges. As it passed, one of the white lights over the hill moved. Not far, maybe the width of my thumb at arm's length. It slid sideways, then stopped. All 4 of us saw it. Lewis said, "That's not a star." There was no joking after that. The light had moved smoothly. No wobble, no arc, just sideways. I got the binoculars again. Now I could see something around it. Not a body exactly, more like a faint, dark area. The point of light sat near one edge of it. I adjusted the focus. The dark area stayed blurry. I tried focusing on the hill instead. The stone wall was visible. The dark shape seemed to be above it. I passed the binoculars to Hannah. She looked for a while. She asked if I could see a black patch around the second light from the right. I said yes. She said it looked rectangular. I thought it looked more oval. Lewis took the binoculars and said he couldn't see any shape at all. That bothered me because I didn't know if I was imagining it. Another light disappeared. 4. The sheep started moving, not running. They all turned at nearly the same time and walked downhill. They stayed grouped together. A few minutes later, we heard a dog barking from somewhere toward the village. Then another dog farther away. Then both stopped. The silence after that felt noticeable. No wind, no traffic, no sheep, no insects against the kitchen window. Even the boiler had stopped running. I opened the back door slightly. There was a low, humming sound outside, very faint. Lewis came over. I asked if he could hear it. He nodded. Imogen said it was probably farm machinery. It didn't sound like machinery to me. It was too steady. No engine variation, just a low tone that seemed to sit under everything else. I stepped outside again. The humming became easier to hear. I couldn't tell which direction it came from. It felt like it was coming through the ground. I put my hand on the wooden fence post. I could feel a slight vibration. Maybe that was imagination. I took my hand away. Another light went out. 3. The remaining 3 were spaced farther apart. One near the left edge of the ridge, one in the middle, one high to the right. The middle one was the brightest. I looked through the binoculars. The cloud behind it was moving faster now. I could see thin gray wisps pass behind the light. At one point, a thicker patch moved through. The light stayed visible the entire time. That proved it to me. Whatever the thing was, it was between us and the clouds. I lowered the binoculars. Something moved along the hill. A dark line crossed the grass below the lights. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Then I realized it was too dark to cast one. It moved from left to right along the slope, slowly. It was difficult to keep track of because it blended into the hillside. I pointed it out. Lewis saw it. The women didn't. The line reached the stone wall and stopped. Then the right-hand light switched off. 2. At that exact moment, the humming stopped. Not faded. Stopped. I could suddenly hear water dripping from the gutter behind me. It felt much louder than it should have. Hannah said we should bring the girls downstairs. I didn't think that was necessary. She said she didn't care. She went up and woke them. We didn't tell them what was happening. We said we were having hot chocolate. Sophie was 8 and Aaron was 6. They came down sleepy and confused, wrapped in blankets. We closed the curtains in the kitchen. That had been Hannah's idea. I didn't argue. For about 15 minutes, we sat around pretending everything was normal. The girls drank hot chocolate. Lewis checked his phone. Imogen started loading the dishwasher. I kept looking toward the curtains. At 11:28, something made a soft sound against the back window, like a fingertip tapping glass. Once. Everyone heard it. The girls didn't react. They were watching something on Hannah's tablet. Lewis and I looked at each other. The sound came again. 2 taps. I walked to the window. The curtain was closed. I didn't open it. I stood there listening. Nothing else. Then there was a faint scrape along the outside sill. I checked the door lock. Locked. We had no outside lights at the back except one small bulb over the door. I switched it on. Nobody opened the curtain. A minute later, the bulb went off. I checked the switch. Still on. I flicked it off and back on. Nothing. Lewis said the bulb had probably blown. I wanted that to be true. Then the kitchen clock stopped. It was one of those cheap battery clocks on the wall. The second hand froze at 11:31. I noticed because the room had become so quiet. I took it down. The battery was nearly new. I tapped the back. The second hand jumped once and stopped. My phone still showed 11:31. So did Lewis's. Then his screen went black. Mine followed a few seconds later. Neither phone would wake up. Hannah's tablet kept playing normally. That made no sense. I plugged my phone into a charger. Nothing. Lewis removed his case and held the power button. Nothing. Then the refrigerator switched off. The kitchen went completely silent. The lights stayed on. I remember hearing Sophie ask why everyone was being weird. Hannah told her we were tired. Then the back door handle moved. Slowly. Down. It stopped halfway. Then returned. Nobody spoke. The girls had not seen it. Imogen moved in front of them. The handle lowered again, this time all the way. The door didn't open because it was locked. It stayed down for maybe 2 seconds. Then released. I walked toward it before thinking better of it. Lewis grabbed my arm. He whispered, "Don't." The handle moved a third time. Nothing knocked, nothing pushed, just the handle. Then the refrigerator came back on. Both our phones lit up. The outside light came on. The wall clock started ticking again. It was 11:38. 7 minutes had passed. None of us knew whether the clock had simply stopped or whether anything else had happened during those minutes. We opened the curtains. There was one light left above the hill, the brightest one. It was much lower. Instead of being above the ridge, it appeared almost level with it. I looked through the binoculars. The light wasn't round anymore. It looked narrow, vertical. I could see mist moving behind it. Then, for the first time, I saw it illuminate something. A small patch of grass below it turned pale. The light was over the hillside, not in the sky beyond. It hung maybe 20 or 30 feet above the slope. I estimated that based on the trees nearby, but I couldn't be certain. Lewis whispered, "That's close." The light moved down, very slowly. The pale patch on the grass followed it. Then it stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. The sheep at the bottom of the field suddenly started running. They went toward the far corner away from the hill. The last light switched off. The hillside disappeared into darkness. At the same moment, the kitchen lights flickered. Once. Then everything stayed normal. We stood there watching the hill. No lights came back. After maybe 10 minutes, a car drove along a road on the far side of the valley. We could see its headlights moving normally. That helped. We eventually put the girls back to bed. Lewis and I stayed downstairs until almost 2. Nothing else happened. There were no more taps, no humming, no problems with the phones. It rained heavily after midnight. By morning, the hill looked completely ordinary. Gray grass, stone walls, a few trees. After breakfast, Lewis and I decided to walk over. Hannah wasn't happy about it, but daylight made the whole thing feel less serious. We followed the public path we had used 2 days earlier. The ground was soaked. There were sheep tracks everywhere. Our boots sank into the mud. We reached the stone wall below where I thought the final light had been. There was nothing obvious. No equipment, no vehicle marks, no burned grass. We walked along the wall. About 50 meters farther up, Lewis stopped. There was a circular patch in the grass, not a perfect circle, maybe 12 feet across. The grass inside it was lying flat, all in the same direction. The ground wasn't scorched. There was no hole, no broken plants. It looked like something heavy had pressed down evenly. I took several photos. Lewis stepped closer, but didn't go inside it. He pointed at the mud around the edge. There were sheep prints leading toward the patch. They stopped about 6 feet away. Then there were prints going around it. Nothing crossed through. We looked for human footprints. Only ours. The rain might have washed older ones away, but there should have been something if somebody had been standing there that morning. Near the center of the flattened grass was a small puddle. The surface was completely still, even though wind was moving the surrounding grass. Lewis crouched beside it. I told him not to touch it. He laughed and said I was being ridiculous, but he didn't touch it. We walked back to the cottage before lunch. The girls were outside with Hannah, throwing a ball near the garden. Sophie ran over and asked if we had found the stars. I asked what she meant. She said the lights from last night. I didn't remember telling her they were stars. I asked what she had seen. She said she had looked through a gap in the kitchen curtains while we were talking. She said there had been little white lights sitting on the hill. Then she said there was someone underneath them. Hannah immediately asked what she meant. Sophie pointed toward the ridge. She said, a tall person, but only when the lights were on. I asked where the person had been standing. She pointed to the same part of the hillside where we had found the flattened grass. Then she picked up the ball and ran back to her sister. I saw the second building about 10 minutes before I reached the research station. At first, I thought I had taken the wrong road. I was driving a medical supply van through the northern part of Iceland, delivering temperature-controlled boxes to a small atmospheric research facility inland from Husavik. My name was Elise Warren. I was 35 at the time, originally from Sheffield, and I had been living in Iceland for almost 4 years. The delivery company I worked for handled remote clinics, labs, and industrial sites. Most of my routes were ordinary: pharmacies, dentists, small hospitals. Every few weeks, I got something farther out. This station was one of those places. I'd been there twice before. The road turned off the main highway and ran inland for about 20 kilometers through empty volcanic ground. No houses, no petrol stations, just low hills, black rock, patches of yellow grass, and mountains farther south. It was early November. The sun had already dropped low, even though it was only a little after 3 in the afternoon. There was snow on the higher ground, but none on the road yet. The weather was clear where I was, with a heavy band of gray cloud hanging over the mountains. The station itself was easy to recognize. It had one long white building, a shorter equipment shed, 3 antenna masts, and a fenced instrument field full of little weather stations. That was what I remembered. So when I came around the final ridge and saw another white building beyond it, I slowed down. The real facility was maybe a kilometer ahead. The second building stood farther back, perhaps another 500 or 600 meters beyond it. Same general shape, long rectangle, flat-looking roof, dark lower section, rows of windows. I honestly assumed the station had expanded. It had been about 7 months since my last delivery, so I thought they had built another lab. The strange part was how similar it looked. Not identical, but close enough that I noticed. The real building had 6 windows along the front. This other one seemed to have 6 too. The real building had a raised entrance section near the middle. So did the second. Even the proportions looked the same. I kept driving. I expected to see construction vehicles or a new access road. There weren't any. The second structure just seemed to sit out on the open ground behind the station. Its windows were lit. That stood out because the daylight was fading quickly. Warm, yellow-white rectangles, maybe 8 or 10 of them. I remember wondering why the older building looked darker if everyone was working in the new one. Then the road dipped. For maybe 30 seconds, I couldn't see either building. When I came up again, the actual station was directly ahead. The second one was still behind it. This time I could see something that looked like a mast beside it, shorter than the station masts, just a dark vertical line against the sky. I parked by the main entrance at 3:18. A technician named Jonas came out to meet me. I knew him from my previous visits. Mid-40s, glasses, always wore a blue insulated jacket even indoors. He helped me move the first cooler box inside. I said, "You've been busy." He asked what I meant. I nodded toward the windows at the back of the building. The new place. He looked at me. "What new place?" I thought he was joking. I said, "The other building." He frowned. "There is no other building." I actually laughed because I assumed we had misunderstood each other. I walked toward the side of the station and pointed. From there, I couldn't see it. The main building blocked most of the view. I said it was behind them, farther out. Jonas followed me around the corner. The second building was there. I could see the top half above a low rise in the ground. Several windows were glowing. I pointed directly at it. That. Jonas stared for maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked at me instead of the building. "What is that?" The way he said it changed everything. He genuinely didn't know. I asked if it belonged to another facility. He said no. I asked if there were farms beyond them. No, he told me there was nothing in that direction for several kilometers except monitoring equipment and old survey markers. Another staff member came outside. Her name was Ragna. She worked in the lab. Jonas told her to look over the ridge. She saw it immediately. She didn't say anything at first. Then she asked if there was a vehicle there. I looked. A small dark shape sat near the left end of the second building. It could have been a car. It could have been part of the structure. Distance was hard to judge in that landscape. Ragna asked me when I first noticed it. I told her before reaching the station. She asked if the lights had been on then. I said yes. Jonas took out his phone and tried photographing it. The image looked bad because of the low light and distance. He zoomed in. We could see the building on the screen, but the windows became fuzzy bright squares. Ragna called someone inside. 2 more people came out. One was the station manager, a Norwegian guy named Eric Lund. The other was a younger researcher named Samir Patel. Eric looked irritated at first, like he expected this to be some misunderstanding. Then he saw it. He stopped walking. Nobody had a normal reaction after that. We all just stood there looking. Eric asked Jonas if any contractors were working nearby. Jonas said no. Eric asked if it could be equipment containers lined up in a way that looked like a building. Ragna said the windows were lit. Eric didn't answer. The second building was maybe 700 meters from where we stood. There was no obvious road leading to it. The ground between us was rough lava, grass, and shallow dips. No tire marks that I could see. No power lines. No fence. No exterior lights. Just those windows. Samir went inside and came back with binoculars. He handed them to Eric first. Eric looked for maybe 15 seconds. Then he lowered them. He didn't say what he had seen. I asked if I could look. Through the binoculars, the building was much clearer. That was when I noticed the windows weren't arranged quite normally. From a distance, they had looked like one row. Through the lenses, some were slightly higher than others. Not enough to look obviously wrong, just enough that I couldn't imagine the rooms inside lining up properly. The front wall also seemed too narrow for the height. It reminded me of looking at a building from a slight angle, except I could see what looked like both ends. There were no doors that I could identify. The center section had a darker rectangle where an entrance should have been, but there was no visible frame. I moved the binoculars toward the lit windows. Most were just light. Then, in one of them, something moved. A shadow crossed from left to right. I lowered the binoculars. I asked if anyone was out there. Everyone said no. Eric asked to see again. I gave them back. He watched. The wind had started picking up. It came across the open ground hard enough that we moved closer to the wall of the station. The second building didn't change. No blowing snow or dust. No movement around it. Just the lit windows. Eric told us to finish unloading the delivery. I think he wanted something normal to do. We carried the remaining boxes inside and checked the temperature seals. That took about 15 minutes. While I filled out the paperwork, everyone kept looking through the windows. One of the staff radios started making a low burst of static. Jonas turned the volume down. Then another radio on the charging rack did the same thing. Nobody commented. I signed the delivery sheet. My phone showed 3:46. It felt like I had been there much longer. Eric said they were going to check their site maps. He asked if I could wait 5 minutes before leaving. I said yes. I wasn't eager to drive past that second building alone anyway. The station had a small kitchen, so Ragna made coffee. Through the kitchen window, I could see only the left end of the strange building above the rise. 3 windows were visible, all lit. Then one went dark. I assumed someone inside had turned the light off. A minute later, it came back on. Then the next window went dark, then back on. The sequence moved from left to right. I called Jonas over. He watched the third window go out. Then it came back. He said something in Icelandic I didn't understand. I asked what. He said, "It is doing that in order." The next visible window went dark, then relit. We moved to the larger observation room. From there, through a side window, we had the best view. The second building was still standing in the same place. The lights continued changing, not randomly. One window darkened, then the next, then the next. Each stayed off for about 3 seconds before coming back. It looked like something was moving through rooms, except the pattern didn't match where hallways should have been. It went across the front, then a window on the far end, then back toward the middle. Samir checked the station's network logs because he thought there might be some kind of electrical interference affecting our perception of the lights. I didn't understand how that would work, but nobody had a better idea. Eric found an older satellite image on his computer. The ground behind the station was empty. He opened a current mapping service. Same. No structures. He said the nearest approved construction was a sensor hut 2 kilometers southeast. This building was west. I asked if there had ever been anything there before. Eric said no. Jonas said the ground was unsuitable anyway. There was a shallow drainage basin beyond the ridge that filled during snowmelt. A permanent building wouldn't be placed there. While we were talking, the ceiling lights flickered. Once, then again. The station lost internet for about 20 seconds. The backup system kicked in. A printer in the office started running even though nobody had sent anything. It printed one blank page, then another. Eric unplugged it. I started feeling like I should leave. I told them that. Nobody tried to stop me. Ragna asked if I could wait until they called someone from the nearby monitoring site. She was already trying. The phone rang, but nobody answered. I checked my own signal. 1 bar. Usually I had at least 3 there. I sent my dispatcher a message saying I was leaving the station. It stayed on sending. Outside, it had become much darker. The clouds had moved over us. The second building was easier to see because of its windows. There were more lights now. I was sure of that. When I first arrived, maybe 8 or 10 windows had been lit. Now I could count at least 14. Some appeared on what looked like a second level. I hadn't noticed a second floor before. I said that to Jonas. He stared. He said there was not a top row. Ragna agreed. The building seemed taller, not dramatically, maybe 1 extra story, but the roofline looked higher against the hillside. I got into my van. Eric walked over and told me to take the same road out and not stop until I reached the highway. That sounded overly serious, but I didn't argue. I started the engine. The dashboard clock said 4:02. As soon as I put the van into gear, all the windows in the second building went dark. Every single one. At once, I stopped moving. The structure was still visible as a pale block against the hillside. Then one light came on, a single window near the center. It was brighter than the others had been. I could see it through the windscreen without binoculars. Something stood in front of it. Not clearly enough to describe, just a dark upright shape. It stayed there. I looked toward the station entrance. Jonas and Eric had both seen it too. Neither moved. The shape in the window shifted slightly. Then the light went out. I drove. The access road passed along the southern side of the real station before turning north toward the ridge. For the first few minutes, I couldn't see the second building because the land blocked it. I kept checking my mirrors. Nothing. The radio in the van was on low. A local station faded into static. I switched it off. Then I heard a clicking noise from the cargo area. 3 clicks. Pause. 3 clicks. I knew the boxes were secured. I didn't stop to check. The road climbed gradually. At the top, there was one point where I should have had a clear view back over both facilities. I looked. The real station was there. White building. Masts. Lights. Beyond it, the other building was gone. Not dark. Gone. The hillside behind the station was empty. I slowed almost to a stop without meaning to. There was no outline, no roof, no lit windows, nothing. I could see the drainage basin Eric had mentioned. Open ground, a few rocks. That was all. I kept driving. About 5 minutes later, my phone suddenly received 3 messages at once. One from dispatch asking if the delivery was complete. 2 from Ragna. The first said, "Do you still see it?" The second came 1 minute later. "Do not turn around." I didn't. I reached the highway around 4:25. There were other cars there, which helped. I drove toward Husavik and stopped at a petrol station. I stayed inside for nearly half an hour. I called the station. Ragna answered. She said the building disappeared less than a minute after I left. They had been watching it. She said there was no fading, no lights switching off, nothing. Eric looked away to check one of the cameras. When he looked back, the hillside was empty. I asked about the camera. Ragna said the outdoor camera had recorded the building, but only as a bright rectangular blur. Then, at 4:06, the entire section of the image turned gray for 9 seconds. When the picture returned, the structure was gone. I asked if they were going out to check the ground. She said not until daylight. I went back to my flat that evening. I told my dispatcher the delivery had been completed normally. I didn't mention the second building. The next morning, I got a message from Jonas. He sent me 4 photographs. They had walked out to the place where we thought the structure had been. There was no foundation, no tire marks, no electrical equipment, nothing that suggested construction. The ground was wet and uneven. In one photo, Jonas had placed his glove beside a shallow depression in the soil. It looked like a rectangular footprint, not a shoe print. More like something with a straight edge had pressed into the ground. There were dozens of them. They ran in 2 parallel lines across the basin. Each depression was about 1 meter long. The lines ended where the building's front wall had appeared to be. I called him. He said the marks were only on one side. There was nothing where the back half of the structure should have stood. I asked if they had found anything else. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said they had found a cable, a short piece of black electrical cable lying on the ground. One end was cleanly cut. The other disappeared straight down into the soil. They pulled on it. It wouldn't move. They dug around it about 30 centimeters. It continued downward. Eric told them to stop. 2 days later, I had another route north. Not to the research station, but close enough that I could see the hills from the main road. Weather was bright, clear sky, good visibility. I slowed near the turnoff without intending to. From the highway, the real station was too far away to see clearly. But for a few seconds, on the ridge behind it, I thought I saw a row of small white rectangles. They looked like windows catching sunlight. A lorry came up behind me, so I accelerated. When I checked the mirror, the ridge was empty. The first bird hit the bedroom window at 4:48 in the morning. It wasn't a hard impact, more of a dull tap followed by the light scratch of claws on the sill. My husband, Alan, woke up before I did and sat up beside me. "What was that?" I was still half asleep. I told him it was probably a bird. We lived in a small village outside Norwich in a detached house we had owned for almost 30 years. My name was Margaret Hale. I was 69 at the time, and Alan was 72. We were both retired. He had worked for the council, and I had been a teaching assistant at a primary school. Our back garden was probably the thing we cared about most in the house. Alan grew vegetables. I kept the flower beds. We had feeders hanging from an old apple tree and another beside the conservatory, so there were always birds around. Sparrows, robins, blue tits, blackbirds. Birds occasionally hit the windows. It happened. This sounded different because the bird didn't fly away. We heard another little scrape. Alan got out of bed and moved the curtain aside. There was a robin sitting on the outside ledge. That didn't seem strange at first. Then he said, "It's facing the wrong way." I got up. The robin had its back to the glass. It was sitting very upright, looking out over the garden. It didn't seem hurt. Its wings looked normal. Its head wasn't drooping. It just sat there. Alan tapped the glass lightly with one finger. The robin didn't react. He tapped again. Nothing. I thought maybe it was stunned from flying into the window. We left it alone. About 2 minutes later, something struck the smaller window in the spare bedroom down the hall. Tap. Alan and I looked at each other. He went to check. A blue tit was sitting on that ledge. Same position, back toward the house, head facing outward. I remember saying, "That's odd." Alan said the birds were probably confused by reflections because dawn was starting. Except it was still almost completely dark. There was only a faint gray strip over the fields to the east. We went downstairs. I put the kettle on while Alan checked the conservatory. 3 sparrows were sitting along the outside frame, perfectly still, all facing the garden. That was when it stopped feeling like coincidence. The birds weren't crashing into the glass. They were landing against it. The little taps we heard were their feet hitting the frame or sill. Alan switched on the outside light. The sparrows didn't move. Normally birds scattered the second that light came on. These didn't even turn their heads. I opened the conservatory door very slowly. Cold air came in. The nearest sparrow was maybe 4 feet away. I expected it to fly. It stayed. I stepped outside. Still nothing. The garden was damp from overnight rain, and there was a thin mist over the lawn. I could hear distant traffic from the main road. No bird song. That stood out immediately. We usually had birds starting before 5 at that time of year. There should have been blackbirds calling from the hedge. There was nothing. The 3 sparrows on the conservatory frame remained completely motionless. I moved closer. Their eyes were open. They were breathing. I could see the feathers on their chests moving. I put my hand out, not close enough to touch one, but close enough that any normal sparrow would have panicked. Nothing. Its head stayed pointed toward the far end of the garden. I followed the direction it was looking. There was nothing there. Fence, shed, hedge. Then fields beyond. Alan came outside. He whispered, "Look at the tree." The apple tree had birds in it, at least a dozen. They were spread across the lower branches. Every one faced the same direction, northwest, not toward the sunrise, not toward the feeders, toward the fields behind the neighboring houses. A blackbird stood on the lawn near the bird bath. It faced northwest too. Alan said maybe there was a predator, a sparrowhawk, cat, fox, something making them freeze. I had seen birds react to hawks. This wasn't like that. They usually went quiet and hid. They didn't line themselves up in the open. We went back inside because it was cold. At 5:03, another bird landed on the kitchen window. Then another. A small finch. Both faced away from us. I started counting them. There were 11 birds sitting against various windows by the time the kettle boiled. None looked at the house. They all watched the same part of the sky. Alan made tea. He kept joking about it because I think he was uncomfortable. He said maybe we were running a bird meeting. I told him I didn't find it funny. He stopped. At 5:09, our neighbor's security light came on. Their back garden was visible over the fence. I looked for their cat because it sometimes came into ours. No cat. Then I noticed birds on their house too. 4 along the gutter, 2 on an upstairs window ledge, same position, facing outward. I called our neighbor Sheila. She answered after several rings. She sounded worried before I even explained. She said, "Are yours doing it too?" That made my stomach tighten. I asked what she meant. She said birds had been tapping at her bedroom window for nearly 20 minutes. Her husband, Jeff, had gone outside and counted more than 30 around their house. Some were sitting on the fence, some on the roof. She said they wouldn't move when he approached. I told her ours were the same. Then she said something I hadn't noticed. They're all looking up. I went back to the conservatory. From inside, I looked carefully at the sparrows. Their heads weren't level anymore. They had tilted upward slightly. All of them. The birds in the apple tree had done the same. I looked into the sky. The mist was low over the fields, but above that the sky was mostly clear. I could see the last bright stars fading. Nothing unusual. Alan got his binoculars. He used them for birdwatching, although he would never have called himself a birdwatcher. He scanned the sky. Nothing. Then he stopped. I asked what he saw. He didn't answer right away. He handed me the binoculars and pointed above the western field. I looked. There was something faint up there. Not an object exactly. More like a patch where the sky looked slightly darker. I lowered the binoculars. I couldn't see it with my eyes. Through the lenses, there was a gray area above the mist. It seemed long and horizontal. I thought it was cloud, but it wasn't moving with the other thin cloud around it. Alan said maybe it was smoke. There was no wind carrying it. It just stayed. I watched for maybe 30 seconds. Then I lost it. The birds didn't. Every head remained tilted toward the same spot. A wood pigeon landed on the conservatory roof. Its claws made a scraping sound overhead. Then another landed, and another. The roof creaked slightly under their weight. I went into the sitting room at the front of the house. There were birds there too, 3 lined along the front fence, 2 on the pavement. One sitting in the middle of our driveway, all facing northwest. The road was empty, streetlights were still on. Everything felt unusually still. Then the radio in the kitchen lost signal. Alan listened to a local station every morning. The presenter's voice suddenly became static. He adjusted the tuner. Nothing. Another station. Static. He switched to FM. Same. I checked my phone. No mobile signal. That happened occasionally inside the house, but Alan's phone showed none either. The Wi-Fi still worked. I sent Sheila a message. It went through. She replied almost immediately. Jeff says don't go out. I asked why. She wrote, he can hear something. Alan was already standing at the back door. I joined him. At first I heard nothing. Then there was a low vibration, so low I felt it before I properly heard it. It seemed far away. A deep, steady tone. Not an engine, not thunder. It had no rise or fall. It was just there. The glass in the back door vibrated very slightly. A spoon on the kitchen draining board trembled against a plate. The birds stayed still. The tone grew stronger. I could feel it in my chest. Alan opened the door a crack. The sound was clearer outside. It seemed to come from above us, not directly overhead, somewhere beyond the fields. I asked Alan if it could be an aircraft. He shook his head. We lived under flight paths. We knew aircraft noise. This didn't travel in the same way. It had no direction I could properly locate. Then the birds began turning their heads, not suddenly, one after another. The robin on the bedroom ledge turned first. I could see it through the conservatory roof reflection. Then the sparrows. Then the birds in the tree. They all tracked something moving across the sky. Their bodies remained still. Only their heads moved, left to right. Alan lifted the binoculars. I asked what he saw. He said, nothing. Then he said, wait. I took the binoculars. There was a faint light inside the gray patch. Very faint, yellow-white. It looked like a distant star seen through mist, but it was moving, slowly. The birds followed it. I watched the light travel eastward. It stopped. The deep tones stopped with it. The silence afterward was so complete that I could hear Alan swallowing beside me. Nothing moved for several seconds. Then one bird on the conservatory frame opened its wings. It didn't leave, it just held them slightly away from its body. The others started doing the same. Not all of them. Maybe half. Their wings trembled. I shut the door. I don't know why. I suddenly didn't want the house open. The faint light moved again, this time toward us. I couldn't judge whether it was actually getting closer or just becoming brighter. I lowered the binoculars. With my eyes alone, I could now see a pale point above the gardens. It wasn't very bright. Still, every bird was facing it. The wood pigeons on the roof started making a low cooing sound, all at once, then stopped. The light disappeared, not behind cloud, just gone. The birds remained. Alan said, "Where did it go?" Before I could answer, the deep tone started again, much louder. This time it came from almost directly overhead. The windows buzzed. The ceiling light in the kitchen flickered. I looked up through the conservatory glass. There was nothing visible. The sky was brightening. Thin cloud moved slowly east. No aircraft. The tone held for maybe 5 seconds, then dropped lower. I felt pressure in my ears like going down in a lift. I swallowed. The pressure stayed. The birds reacted. Every bird around the garden lowered its body at the same time. They flattened against ledges, branches, roof tiles, not taking cover. More like something was pushing them down. The grass beneath the apple tree moved. A broad circular patch pressed flat. Alan saw it too. He grabbed my arm. The patch was maybe 12 feet across. There was no wind anywhere else. The grass simply bent away from the center, then slowly lifted. The tone changed again. Higher. The birds raised themselves. My ears popped. The kitchen radio came back for half a second. A man's voice said part of a sentence, then static again. I could hear Sheila shouting from next door. Jeff answered her from outside. Alan started toward the door. I told him not to go. He said he wanted to make sure Jeff was all right. Before he reached the handle, something crossed above the roof. I didn't see it. I heard the tiles respond. A soft pressure sound moved from the back of the house to the front. Not footsteps. It was too broad. More like a heavy gust passing over. Except the trees didn't move. A shadow went across the kitchen. Very faint. The sun wasn't up yet, so it made no sense. The room darkened for less than a second. The birds all looked toward the front of the house. Then the deep tone stopped. Immediately, every bird left, not one at a time. All together, the sound of wings was enormous. Sparrows, finches, pigeons, blackbirds. They lifted from our garden, Sheila's house, the hedges, the roofs. Hundreds, once I saw how many had been sitting farther away. They all flew southeast. No circling, no scattered directions. One movement. Within seconds, the garden was empty. A few feathers floated down near the apple tree. Alan and I stood in the kitchen without speaking. The radio returned. Normal music. Both phones showed signal again. The clock on the oven said 5:24. I checked my mobile. 5:31. Alan said 5:31 too. The oven clock had lost 7 minutes. We hadn't had a power cut. No other digital clocks were wrong. At 5:40, Jeff knocked on our back door. He looked pale. He said he had gone out because he thought something was frightening the birds. He had walked to the end of his garden. From there, he saw a faint light over the fields. He said it was shaped like a thin line, not round. When the tones started overhead, he had felt pressure on his shoulders. He crouched because he thought he was becoming dizzy. Then he looked at the grass around him. It was bending downward too. Sheila had shouted at him to come inside. He did. We made coffee. All four of us sat in our kitchen as the sun came up. The gardens looked normal in daylight. A few birds returned after 6, not many. They stayed in the hedge and didn't approach the feeders. Around 7, Alan and Jeff went into the field behind the houses. I told them not to, but they went anyway. They came back 20 minutes later. There was a patch in the grass beyond the boundary hedge, not flattened exactly, bent, a long oval area maybe 30 feet across. The grass around the edge leaned outward. Inside the shape, it stood upright. There were no tire tracks, no footprints except Alan's and Jeff's. The ground wasn't burned, nothing smelled strange. By mid-morning, most of the grass had returned to normal. For several mornings afterward, I woke before dawn without needing an alarm. No birds hit the windows. The feeders stayed unusually quiet. About a week later, the robin came back. I recognized it because it had a little pale patch beside its beak. It landed on the kitchen ledge just before sunrise. For a moment, I thought everything had returned to normal. Then the robin turned its back to the glass. It looked toward the northwest field. I went outside. No other birds were around. The sky was clear. I stood beside the conservatory and listened. Nothing. The robin remained still for almost a minute. Then it suddenly flew away. A few seconds later, very high above the house, something made one low, distant tone. Only once. The first barge was sitting about 2 feet farther from the bank than I had left it. I noticed it just before 6 in the morning because I nearly stepped into the gap. I worked maintenance on a canal section outside Stoke-on-Trent, mostly checking moorings, clearing rubbish from lock gates, inspecting towpath damage, and dealing with whatever had gone wrong overnight. That morning was cold and foggy, the kind where everything sounded closer than it was. I could hear traffic from the main road, but couldn't see it. My name was Peter Mallory. I was 47 then and had worked around canals for almost 20 years. I knew how boats shifted. Water level changed, wind pulled at them, passing traffic gave them a push, ropes stretched. None of that was unusual. This was. The barge was one of three old work barges tied along a concrete service bank near a maintenance yard. They were ugly steel things, flat-sided, heavy even when empty. We used them for hauling timber, dredged rubbish, broken fencing, whatever needed moving. They had been tied tight the evening before. I knew because I had tied two of them myself. The first one, which we called Mavis because somebody had painted the name on the stern years earlier, was sitting out from the bank with both ropes still tied. Not loose, still tied. The stern line went from the cleat on the barge to a steel ring set into the bank. The bow line did the same. Both ropes were tight enough that they formed straight lines over the water, but the boat was away from the edge. That should not have been possible. I put my bag down and pulled on the stern rope. Solid. No extra length. I checked the knot. Same bowline I had tied. No slipping. No damage. I walked to the front. Same thing. The barge wasn't floating at an angle either. It was sitting parallel to the bank, just farther out. I stood there looking at it for a while. Then I noticed the second barge. It had moved too. Not as far. Maybe a foot. The third one was about the same. All three were separated from the bank by gaps they shouldn't have had, while their ropes remained tight. My first thought was the canal level had dropped. That would change the angle of the ropes and could pull a boat slightly outward depending on where the rings were positioned. I looked at the watermarks on the wall. Normal level, maybe an inch low. Nothing close to enough. I called our depot manager, Kevin Hughes. He was already on his way in. I told him the barges had shifted. He asked if somebody had taken them out. I said not, unless they had untied and retied every rope exactly the same. Kevin said he'd look when he got there. I started my usual morning inspection. The fog was thick enough that I could only see maybe 100 meters down the canal. Everything was damp. The towpath had wet footprints from joggers and dog walkers, but inside the fenced maintenance area there were only mine. The gate had still been locked when I arrived. No cut chain, no damage. About 10 minutes later, I heard a bump behind me, a heavy metal knock. I turned around. The nearest barge moved slightly, not toward the bank, away. The ropes tightened. I watched the stern line rise maybe an inch above the water, then stop. I walked over. The barge settled. There was no wind. The water around it was almost completely flat. I put one hand on the rope. It was under serious tension, more than it should have been. Then, while I was holding it, the tension disappeared. The rope sagged. The barge drifted a few inches back toward the wall. I nearly lost my balance because I'd been leaning against it. I looked underneath the barge. The water was dark and still. Nothing there. I told myself maybe something had caught underneath. A branch, a submerged log. The canal picked up all kinds of rubbish, but that didn't explain all three boats. Kevin arrived around 6:20. By then, the fog had begun lifting slightly. He walked over to Mavis and immediately said, "Who moved that?" I said that was what I had been trying to tell him. He checked the ropes himself. Kevin was older than me and had worked on waterways most of his life. He didn't get excited about strange things. He stared at the stern line for maybe 30 seconds. Then he asked when I had last seen the boats. I told him about 4:30 the previous afternoon. He asked if we had any overnight water releases from the lockup stream. We hadn't. He called control anyway. Water level logs showed nothing unusual. No gate openings, no emergency discharge, no reported vessel movement between midnight and 5. We walked along all three barges. There was a thin line on the concrete where the rubber fenders normally rubbed the bank. The line showed where each boat usually sat. Everyone was out from it. Kevin said maybe the ropes had shrunk. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't exactly joking. Wet rope could tighten in certain conditions, but these were synthetic mooring lines. And even if all 6 ropes somehow shortened overnight, they would have pulled the barges toward the bank rings, not suspended them neatly farther away. We loosened the lines and pulled the barges back in. Nothing felt caught underneath. No resistance. Mavis came in easily. The others did too. Kevin retied them himself. He pulled every knot tight and marked the ropes with a paint pen where they passed through the cleats. That was his idea. If anything slipped, we would know. By 7:30, other staff had arrived. I told one of the lads, Faisal, what had happened. He thought somebody was messing with us. He checked the padlock on the yard gate, still fine. Then he said we should look at the cameras. We had 2 security cameras. One covered the gate and yard, the other covered most of the service bank where the barges were moored. Nobody had thought of checking because the camera system was mainly there for theft. The office computer was old and took forever to load recordings. Fazal pulled up the footage from midnight. We started fast forwarding. Nothing much happened. Fog, occasional headlights through the trees. A fox crossed the yard at 1:08. At 2:16, the picture flickered. We slowed it down. For maybe 3 seconds, the image became darker. Not the whole frame. The canal, the water under the barges turned almost black. Kevin said it was probably the camera adjusting exposure. We watched it again. The concrete bank stayed the same brightness. The boats stayed the same. Only the water changed. There was a dark area moving beneath them. It started at the left edge of the frame and passed under the first barge, then the second, then the third. It was difficult to tell if it was on the surface or under it. It looked broad, much wider than a person, maybe the width of a car. Faisal asked if it could be a shadow from something on the towpath. There was no visible source. We kept watching. At 2:16 and 17 seconds, something even stranger happened. The water level appeared to drop, only underneath the barges. I know how that sounds. The rest of the canal didn't visibly lower, but the dark water along the bank seemed to sink several inches. The side of Mavis became more exposed. You could see a strip of wet hull appear above the waterline. Then the barge shifted outward. The ropes went tight. The second moved, then the third. It happened slowly, over maybe 5 seconds. Then the water rose back. The boats stayed where they had moved. Nobody spoke for a bit. Kevin replayed it. Same thing. Faisal said there had to be some kind of optical effect, fog, compression, reflection. I wanted that to be true. We zoomed in, the picture quality got worse, but the hull movement became obvious. The boats physically moved. The ropes changed angle. The water under them darkened. Then everything returned to normal except their position. There was no splash, no wave, no wake, nothing. Kevin told Faisal to save the clip. The recording software gave us an error. We tried again. Same error. It said the selected segment was unavailable for export. We could play it. We could pause it. We just couldn't save it. Kevin took out his phone and filmed the monitor. That worked. He told us not to start telling everyone until we understood what we were looking at. Naturally, everyone knew by lunch. People had theories. A submerged object. A pressure change from a lock. A big fish. Someone even suggested a seal, which was ridiculous where we were. The largest thing I had ever seen in that stretch of canal was a dead shopping trolley. Around midday, I went back outside to check the paint marks on the ropes. All 6 were unchanged. The barges were where we had retied them. I was crouched near the second one when I noticed bubbles. A narrow line of them was coming up about 3 feet from the hull. Not a lot, just small bubbles, one after another. They moved slowly along the length of the boat. I followed them. They reached the bow, stopped, then started again beside the third barge. I called Kevin over. By the time he arrived, they were gone. He looked at me like maybe I had joined the group of people making the story bigger. I told him exactly what I had seen. He said we would inspect underneath with the pole. We had a long aluminum-sounding pole used for checking depth and debris. I took it to the gap between the bank and Mavis. The canal there was roughly 6 feet deep. I lowered the pole. It touched bottom normally. I moved farther out. Same. Then, near the middle of the second barge, the pole stopped after about 3 feet. I assumed I had hit the hull. I moved it outward. Still stopped. I pushed harder. Whatever was below gave slightly. Not soft like mud, more like rubber. I pulled the pole up. Kevin took it. He lowered it into the same place. Straight down. Stopped. He pressed. The pole bent a little. Then whatever was under it moved. The pole dropped suddenly another 3 feet and hit the canal bottom. Kevin nearly fell forward. He pulled it out fast. There was black residue on the end, a thin, greasy smear. He rubbed some between his fingers. It didn't smell like oil. It smelled earthy, like wet stone. He wiped it off on a rag. We both looked at the water. Nothing surfaced. Kevin said we were not putting anyone in there. That had apparently been my next question before I asked it. He called a contractor we sometimes used for underwater inspections. They couldn't come until the following morning. The rest of the afternoon was quiet. By 4, the weather had cleared. There was even some sun. The canal looked completely ordinary. I left around 5. Before I went, I checked every paint mark. Still lined up. Kevin was staying another hour and said he would check again before locking up. At 5:42, he called me. I was in Tesco. He said Mavis had moved. I thought he meant away from the bank again. He said no. It had moved forward, about 18 inches. Both ropes were still tied. The paint marks were still aligned. That was impossible. For a boat to move forward while both lines remained fixed, either the ropes had to change length or the attachment points had to move. The rings were set in concrete. The cleats were welded to the boat. I drove back. It was dark when I arrived. Kevin had all the yard lights on. Mavis was definitely forward of where we had left it. The stern now lined up with a different crack in the concrete. We measured the ropes. Same length. We measured between the bank rings. Same. Kevin looked tired more than frightened. He said, "I don't like this." That was the first time he admitted it. We decided to add 2 extra lines to each barge. Not because we thought they would stop anything, mostly because we wanted more reference points. We tied bright nylon ropes at opposite angles and marked those too. Then Kevin opened the office camera feed on his phone. He had figured out how to view it remotely. We stood beside the boats watching the live image of ourselves. There was about a 2-second delay. I waved. 2 seconds later, the me on the screen waved. Kevin walked along the bank. Screen Kevin followed. Everything normal. Then the phone image froze, only for a second. When it resumed, the canal behind us looked black. I turned around. In person, the water looked normal. On the phone, there was a dark patch under the barges. Kevin held the screen next to the real scene. We could compare them. Real water, dull brown under the yard lights. Camera water, almost completely black. The dark patch moved, left to right, under Mavis. Kevin said, "Pete." I was already backing away. The nearest barge creaked. The extra rope tightened, then another. I looked at the water line. It dropped. Not the whole canal. Just a section maybe 20 feet long beside the bank. The water seemed to pull downward. The hull became exposed by several inches. I could see wet steel shining. The barge moved away from us, slowly. All 4 ropes tightened. The knots didn't slip. The ropes themselves didn't stretch enough to explain it. They just changed angle as if the points they were tied to were no longer where they appeared to be. I stepped back until I hit the fence. There was no sound except rope fibers creaking under tension. The dark patch appeared on the actual water then. I could see it, a broad shape beneath the surface. No clear outline, just darkness moving through darker water. It passed under the second barge. The water lowered beneath that one too, then the third. For a few seconds, all 3 boats sat strangely low and far from the bank, like something underneath them had taken the water with it. Then the patch reached the end of the mooring. The canal surface rose, not with a splash. It simply returned. The barges rocked once, the ropes relaxed, a small wave hit the concrete edge. Then everything stopped. Kevin and I stood there listening. Farther down the canal, something made a long scraping sound. Not metal, not wood, more like something heavy moving along the bottom. It traveled away from us into the dark. Then we couldn't hear it anymore. We locked the yard and left together. I followed Kevin's van until we reached the main road. I got home just after 7. My wife, Angela, asked why my trousers were wet at the knees. I hadn't noticed. There was a dark line across both legs, maybe 6 inches above the bottom, like I had stood in shallow water. I hadn't gone into the canal. I changed clothes and put the trousers in the utility sink. When I rinsed them, the water turned slightly black. The same earthy smell came off them that had been on the sounding pole. The contractor arrived the next morning with a small inspection camera and sonar unit. I went in early. All 3 barges were back against the bank. Every rope was still tied. Every paint mark lined up. The extra ropes were still in place. There was no slack that could explain how the boats had moved the night before. The contractor checked underneath. No logs, no debris, no damaged hulls. Nothing unusual on the bottom except one area of soft sediment about 15 feet from the bank. He lowered the camera toward it. The picture showed mud and cloudy water. Then the screen went dark for about 2 seconds. When it came back, the camera was facing upward. Nobody had moved the cable. The lens was pointing toward the underside of Mavis. Across the steel hull was a clean, wet mark, long and narrow. It ran from one side of the barge to the other. The contractor pulled the camera up. He asked if something had recently been strapped underneath. Kevin said no. We climbed onto the barge and checked the deck. Everything normal. Then I noticed the stern rope. The paint line still matched perfectly. But between the cleat and the bank, in the middle of the rope where nothing could have touched it, there was a damp black band about the width of my hand. The fibers weren't damaged. They were just wet. Kevin touched it. He smelled his fingers. Then he looked at me. Neither of us said anything. The clicking started in the spare room at sunset. The first evening I noticed it, I thought something electrical was cooling down. It was late August, and I had just moved into a rented house on the edge of Lincoln, Nebraska. My name was Mara Ellis. I was 32 at the time, worked remotely doing medical billing, and had been in the house for about 3 weeks. It was a normal single-story place in a newer development. 2 bedrooms, small office, attached garage, unfinished basement. Nothing old or unusual about it. The spare room was mostly empty. I had a folding table in there, 2 cardboard boxes, and an old floor lamp I hadn't plugged in yet. Around 8 in the evening, just as the sun was dropping behind the houses across the street, I heard a faint clicking from that room. Click. Pause. Click. Pause. It was quiet enough that I only noticed because the air conditioning had shut off. I walked in. Nothing. The sound seemed to come from somewhere near the far wall. I checked the outlets. No chargers, no clocks, no electronics at all. The floor lamp was unplugged. I stood there for maybe a minute. The clicking stopped. I went back to the kitchen. A few minutes later, it started again. Same slow rhythm. I ignored it. The house was new to me. Houses made noises. The next evening, it happened again, almost the same time. I was washing a plate when I heard it through the hallway. Click, click, click. I checked my phone. 8:06. Sunset was around then. That was the first time I noticed the timing. I went into the spare room and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the wall exactly. It felt more central, like it was hanging in the room somewhere. That sounds stranger than it was at the time. I figured sound was bouncing around because the room had no furniture. I put my ear near the vent. Nothing. Near the window. Nothing. Near the floor. Still nothing. Then the clicking stopped again. It lasted maybe 4 minutes total. The third evening, I recorded it. I wasn't scared. I was mostly annoyed. I wanted to figure out what it was before calling the landlord and sounding ridiculous. I put my phone on the folding table around 7:50 and started a voice recording. The clicking began at 8:03. Very faint. 1 click every 2 seconds or so. I stood in the hallway and listened. After about a minute, a small plane passed overhead. That wasn't unusual. The house was under a route used by private aircraft heading toward the airport. I heard the engine first, then the clicking changed. It became faster. Click, 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 click. Maybe twice the speed. I walked into the room. The sound kept going. As the aircraft got louder, the clicks got faster. Then the plane passed south of the house and the engine noise faded. The clicking slowed, back to the original pace. I remember standing there with my arms folded, thinking that was interesting. Not creepy, just interesting. I assumed the aircraft vibration was affecting something. A vent flap, a loose piece of siding, maybe something inside the wall. I checked outside after dark. Nothing loose around the spare room window. No branches touching the roof. No utility cables close to the wall. I listened to the recording. The clicks were there, although much quieter than they had sounded in person. I pulled the audio into a basic editing program on my laptop because I sometimes cleaned up recordings for work presentations. The pattern was surprisingly regular. Before the plane came over, the clicks were about 1.8 seconds apart. During the loudest part of the flyover, they dropped to around half a second, then gradually slowed. That made me think vibration even more. The next evening, I tested it. I sat in the spare room before sunset with my laptop and the flight tracking website open. At 8:01, the clicking started. At 8:05, a Cessna passed a few miles north. The clicks sped up. At 8:11, another aircraft crossed almost directly overhead. They sped up a lot. For a few seconds, it sounded like someone lightly tapping a pen against glass, then slow again. I put my hand against the wall. No vibration I could feel. I touched the window. Nothing. The floor. Nothing. I even turned the air conditioning off at the thermostat. The clicking continued. After full dark, it stopped. That became the pattern for the next week. It started around sunset. It lasted anywhere from 10 to 25 minutes. Aircraft made it faster. Cars didn't. Trucks didn't. Thunder one evening didn't. Only aircraft. I told my friend Nora about it. She lived in Omaha and came down that Saturday. I waited until she had heard it herself before telling her the aircraft part. At 7:56, we were sitting on the floor in the spare room with 2 glasses of wine. The first click came from somewhere behind us. Nora looked over her shoulder. Another click. She said, "Okay, that's real." We laughed. Then a jet crossed high overhead. The clicks accelerated. Nora stopped smiling. She walked around the room trying to locate the source. She said it sounded like it was moving. I hadn't noticed that before. Once she said it, I heard it too. One click seemed to come near the window, the next near the closet, then near the ceiling. Not dramatically, just enough that I couldn't pin it down. Nora suggested insects, some kind of beetle in the wall. I liked that explanation. Then I asked why a beetle would care about airplanes. She said maybe vibration. Same thing I'd been telling myself. We went outside. The clicking was not audible through the exterior wall, only inside the room. We checked the attic access in the hallway. The attic was hot, dusty, and full of insulation. No clicking up there either. When we came back down, it was still going in the spare room. Nora stood in the doorway and said something that bothered me later. She said, "It sounds like it knows when they're coming." I asked what she meant. She said the clicking seemed to speed up before she could hear the aircraft. I told her the engine noise might just be too faint for us to notice at first. She agreed. We left it at that. But the next night, I tested it. I watched the recording levels instead of listening for aircraft. At 8:08, the clicking started speeding up. I checked the flight tracker. There was a small plane about 8 miles east heading toward me. I couldn't hear it. Not yet. The clicking accelerated anyway. About 40 seconds later, I heard the engine. That happened twice more that week. The clicking changed before the aircraft became audible. That was when I stopped telling people about it. I didn't want more opinions. I wanted a normal explanation first. I emailed the landlord, Greg, and said there was a repetitive noise in one bedroom around dusk. He came over the next afternoon. Of course, nothing happened because it wasn't sunset. He checked the vent, electrical outlets, smoke detector, window frame. He went into the attic and looked around. He said there was nothing obvious. I asked if there were pipes in that wall. No. He told me to record it if it happened again. I didn't tell him I already had hours of recordings. For the next several days, the clicking got louder. Not much, but enough that I could hear it from the living room. The timing also became more exact. It usually started within 2 or 3 minutes of the sun reaching the horizon. I checked sunset times online. The start shifted with them. That bothered me more than the aircraft connection. Mechanical systems didn't know when sunset was. Light-sensitive devices did, obviously, but there was nothing in the room connected to anything like that. One evening, I covered the window completely. I taped thick cardboard over the glass before sunset. The room was dark. The clicking still started. I left the hallway light off too. Same. I unplugged everything in that section of the house, including lamps in nearby rooms. Same. I shut off the breaker to the spare room. The clicking continued. That night I sat in there in total darkness with the power off and my phone recording. I could hear it clearly. Click, click, click. Then faster. Click, click, click. A plane passed over about a minute later. I remember feeling embarrassed by how frightened I was getting. Nothing was threatening me. It was just a sound. But it had started feeling less like a house noise and more like activity, like something was responding. I slept with the spare room door closed after that. One Tuesday, I got home late from the grocery store. The sun had already set. I expected the clicking to be finished. As I carried bags through the kitchen, I heard it. Very fast, almost continuous. I put the groceries down. It was coming from the spare room. I checked the flight tracker. There were 3 aircraft nearby, one commercial flight high to the west, one small aircraft north, and another approaching from southeast. The clicking sounded frantic. Then all 3 aircraft changed direction. I know that may have had nothing to do with anything. The commercial flight continued normally. The smaller one turned east. The third curved south. Within a few minutes, the area above my neighborhood was empty. The clicking slowed. I stood in the hallway and watched the dark doorway. I didn't go in. Then there were 4 loud clicks, different from the others. Click, 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 evenly spaced. The sound stopped. It did not start again that night. The next evening was completely normal. No clicking. That should have made me feel relieved. It didn't. By then I was used to it. The silence felt wrong. I sat in the spare room from before sunset until almost 9. Nothing. No clicks. Several planes passed. Nothing. The following evening, same thing. Silence. I actually started wondering if whatever had been causing it had finally broken. Then on Friday, the clicking came back. It started earlier than usual, about 10 minutes before sunset, very slow. 1 click every 4 or 5 seconds. I opened the flight tracker, no aircraft close. I started recording. The clicks continued at the same pace for about 6 minutes. Then they sped up. I checked the map. A small plane was approaching from the west. I waited. The clicks became faster. Then, before I heard the plane, they stopped. Completely. I looked at the recording waveform. Flat. The plane passed north of the house maybe a minute later. The clicking did not return. I had never heard it stop while an aircraft was still nearby. I walked to the window. The sky was mostly clear except for a thin band of clouds low in the west. Sunset had turned everything orange near the horizon, but above me, the sky was already dark blue. I saw nothing unusual. Then the neighborhood dogs started barking. Not all at once, one behind my house, then another down the block, then 2 more. I stepped outside through the back door. The air was warm and still. I could hear the small plane fading north. The dogs kept barking. Then they stopped, every one of them. At almost the same moment, I looked up. Something crossed above the house. I didn't see it at first. I saw what it blocked. There were maybe 6 or 7 bright stars visible overhead by then. A section of them disappeared. Not behind cloud. The sky itself stayed clear. The stars just vanished in a moving patch. I stared upward. The shape was hard to see because it was almost exactly the same color as the sky. Darker, but only slightly. It moved from west to east, slowly. No lights, no sound. I thought it might be a large bird at first. Then I realized it was much too big. I couldn't judge altitude. That was the problem. If it was low, it might have been 20 or 30 feet wide. If it was high, it was enormous. There were no edges I could clearly follow. It was more like a broad, dark area moving across the stars. I waited for aircraft noise. Nothing came. No rotor, no jet, no propeller. The object crossed directly above my roof. At that moment, the porch light dimmed. Not off, just weaker. My phone screen went dark. It was still recording audio, but the display shut off. I pressed the side button. Nothing. I looked back up. The dark shape continued east. It crossed in front of a thin cloud. That was when I saw the outline better. The cloud behind it disappeared in a clean, curved section. The shape was wider at the front, narrowing slightly toward the back. Not a triangle, not a disc, just an uneven dark form. I could not see any surface. It passed over the next row of houses. Still silent. 1 streetlight turned off beneath it. Then another. The first came back on a few seconds later. The second followed. I stood in my yard watching until the dark patch reached the eastern horizon and blended into the night. The whole thing lasted maybe 40 seconds, maybe less. My phone screen came back. The recording was still running. I ended it. Inside the house, the spare room was silent. I closed the door. I slept on the couch with the television on. The next morning, I listened to the recording. The clicking was clear. Slow at first, then faster. Then it stopped at 8:14 and 32 seconds. There was normal outdoor sound after that. A distant plane. A dog. Me opening the back door. Then, right before the dog stopped barking, the recording picked up something I hadn't heard outside. A very low pulsing sound. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 more. It lasted around 12 seconds. Then silence. I checked the flight tracker history. There had been no registered aircraft directly over the house at 8:15. The small plane I had seen on the map was already several miles north. I sent Greg another message and asked if he could come look at the spare room again. He came that weekend. I didn't tell him about the thing in the sky. We moved the folding table, pulled out the boxes, checked the wall and floor. When we moved the rug I had put down a few weeks earlier, Greg stopped. There was a small circular mark on the hardwood underneath, about the size of a quarter. It looked darker than the surrounding wood. He touched it. The spot was cold, not slightly cool. Cold enough that he pulled his finger back. We checked the basement below that room. Nothing there, no pipe, no vent, no electrical line directly underneath. Then Greg said he would send someone to check for moisture. The clicking did not happen that evening. It didn't happen the next. For almost 2 weeks, the room stayed quiet. Then one morning, while I was getting ready for work, I heard a single click from the spare room. It was 7:20. Full daylight. I stood in the doorway. Nothing else happened. I walked to the window. On the glass near the top, there was a small patch of condensation on the inside. The house was cool and dry. The rest of the window was clear. I wiped it with my sleeve. Under the moisture were 3 tiny clean circles in the dust. They were evenly spaced. I looked outside. High above the neighborhood, a commercial jet was passing east. A few seconds later, from somewhere behind me in the empty room, I heard 3 quick clicks. We noticed the second shadows while we were cleaning mackerel on the deck. There were 4 of us on the boat that night. Me, my cousin Leon, our friend Gareth Miles, and Gareth's brother-in-law, Tomasz Nowak. We had gone out from Newland that afternoon on Gareth's 30-foot fishing boat, mostly for pollock and mackerel. Nothing commercial. Just a long evening trip because the weather had finally settled after several windy days. My name was Owen Barrett. I was 40 at the time and lived near Penzance. I had fished around that coast since I was a teenager. I wasn't someone who spent much time thinking about strange lights or things in the sky. If I saw a light offshore, I thought boat, helicopter, plane, buoy, or some idiot with a drone, usually in that order. It was around 11:30 at night. The sea was almost flat, with just enough swell to make the boat lift and settle slowly. There were thin clouds moving in from the west, but the moon was still visible most of the time. It was bright enough that we weren't using the main deck lights because they ruined our night vision. Gareth had one small white work light on near the stern. That was it. We were about 5 miles offshore, maybe a little more. Leon was the one who noticed the shadows. He was standing beside the bait table with a knife in one hand and said, "Why have I got 2?" I thought he meant fish. Then he pointed at the deck. His shadow from the stern light stretched forward and slightly left. There was another shadow beside it, fainter, longer, pointing almost the opposite direction. I looked down at my own feet, same thing. One dark shadow from the boat light, one pale gray shadow extending toward the stern. I immediately looked at the moon. The moon was behind us and off the starboard side. That explained a shadow, but not the direction of the second one. Gareth said it was probably the moon and the deck light crossing. We turned the work light off. The darker shadow disappeared. The pale one stayed. That should have settled it. Moonlight. Except it was pointing the wrong way. If the moon was behind my right shoulder, the shadow should have fallen forward and left. This one stretched almost directly behind me. Tomasz moved across the deck. His shadow moved with him. We all watched it. He stopped by the cabin door. The shadow extended from his boots toward the stern rail. Leon said, "There's a light out front somewhere." We looked toward the bow. Nothing. Just dark sea. The horizon was clear enough to see the line where the water met the sky. No vessel lights. No lighthouse beam. No fishing boats close enough to cast anything. Gareth turned on the navigation display. The nearest AIS contact was a cargo ship several miles south. There were a couple of fishing vessels farther east. Nothing ahead of us. I walked to the bow. If there had been a bright source in front of the boat, I should have been able to see it. I couldn't. The second shadow remained. It wasn't very dark. You had to know where to look. But once I had seen it, I couldn't stop seeing it. The strange part started a few minutes later. The shadow rotated, not because we moved. The boat was drifting, but our heading was staying fairly steady. I was standing near the cabin with my feet planted. The pale shadow behind me slowly shifted toward my left, maybe 10 degrees, then 20. I turned around because I assumed the source was moving across the sky. Nothing was there. I checked the moon, same position. Clouds passed near it, but it stayed visible. Leon said, "Mine's doing it too." All 4 second shadows were rotating together, slowly, clockwise around us. Gareth started the engine. I asked what he was doing. He said he wanted to change our heading. That made sense. He turned the boat about 90 degrees. The normal moon shadow shifted exactly as expected. The pale second shadow didn't. It continued its slow rotation across the deck, independent of the boat. That was the first moment. Nobody had an easy explanation. Gareth killed the engine again. Tomasz took out his phone and pointed the camera down. The shadows showed up, but not clearly. The phone kept adjusting exposure because of the moonlight. He switched to video. The second shadows looked more obvious when we moved our arms. Each arm had a faint duplicate. I held one hand out. The moon cast a thin shadow across my jacket. The other light cast another one at a different angle. I waved slowly. 2 shadows moved. I looked all around the horizon. Still nothing. We checked above us. The sky was mostly clear directly overhead. A few stars. Thin cloud farther west. No aircraft lights. No helicopter. No glow. I remember feeling more confused than frightened. There had to be a source. Shadows didn't happen without light. We just couldn't see it. Leon suggested Venus, which made absolutely no sense, but that was the level of explanation we were reaching for. Gareth said maybe some sort of military flare was hanging far away. I had seen parachute flares before. You could see the flare. Also, they flickered and dropped. This light, whatever was making the shadow, seemed steady. The second shadow had now rotated nearly halfway around me. It pointed to starboard, then gradually forward. That meant the unseen light source was moving around the opposite side. I started watching the water instead of the sky. Sometimes you could spot a reflection before you saw the actual light. Nothing. The sea had only the moon's broken reflection on it. No second streak, no bright patch, no glowing horizon. Tomasz leaned over the rail and said there was something odd with the water beside us. We looked. At first, I didn't see it. Then I noticed the small ripples around the boat were changing direction. Not all of them, just a narrow patch off the port side. They seemed flattened, like a smooth oval moving across the normal texture of the sea. It was maybe 20 yards away. Hard to tell in darkness. The smooth area moved slowly toward the bow. There was no wake around it, no fin, no object breaking the surface. We watched it for maybe 15 seconds. Then it blended back into the water. At the same time, our second shadows stopped rotating. They all pointed forward. Gareth said, "I don't like that." Nobody joked with him. We started packing the rods away. The plan had been to stay out another hour or two, but we had enough fish and the mood had changed. While Leon was closing one of the storage lockers, there was a soft metallic knock underneath the hull. One knock. Not a wave slap, not the prop. Something hit the bottom. We froze. A few seconds later, it happened again. Farther back. Tomasz said maybe floating wood. The sea was calm enough that we should have seen anything large drifting alongside. Gareth went to the helm and started the engine. The diesel turned over normally. As soon as it caught, the second shadows moved, not rotated. Jumped. They shifted maybe 30 degrees all at once, then held still. Gareth looked at me through the cabin window. He had seen it too. He put us in gear. We started heading towards shore. The strange shadows stayed on the deck. That made no sense if the source was fixed somewhere behind us. We were moving at maybe 8 knots. The second shadow kept its relationship to us for several minutes. Then it began rotating again, slowly. Gareth checked the compass. Our heading was steady northeast. The moon remained off our right side. The pale shadows turned clockwise. Forward, then toward port. Then behind us. It was like something was circling the boat, except nothing was visible. Leon said that out loud. Something's going around us. I told him not to say things like that. He asked what else it looked like. I didn't answer. We started scanning with a handheld spotlight. Gareth kept one on board for checking lines and buoys. I swept it across the water behind us. The beam showed only small waves. Then port side. Nothing. Starboard? Nothing. I pointed it upward. Mist. Cloud. Black sky. The second shadows faded whenever I aimed the spotlight toward the deck because the white beam overpowered them. When I switched it off, they returned. Tomasz said the direction had changed again while I was looking away. Now they pointed almost directly toward the cabin. Whatever was producing them should have been behind the stern. We all looked back. Empty sea. Then Gareth said there was a light. Very faint. I couldn't see it at first. He pointed above the horizon, maybe 20 degrees up. There was something there. Not a normal point of light, more like a dim gray glow against the sky. I thought it was a patch of thinner cloud with moonlight getting through, but the moon was on the other side. The glow was behind us. It barely stood out. You could lose it by looking directly at it. I stared slightly to one side and could see it better. A soft, pale oval. No hard edges, no blinking. It moved, very slowly from left to right. The second shadows changed with it. That was our source, or at least something in the same direction. We watched it for a while. Nobody spoke much. The glow seemed too weak to cast visible shadows. That was what bothered me. It looked no brighter than a patch of night cloud. But our shadows were clear enough to see on the deck. Gareth increased speed, the engine got louder, the glow stayed in roughly the same place behind us, not falling away, not getting smaller. The GPS showed us moving. I could see the wake. We were definitely making ground. The light stayed. Then the VHF radio crackled. No voice, just a short burst of static. Gareth adjusted the squelch, another burst. Then 3 quick clicks came through the speaker. Pause. 3 more. Leon said, "Turn that off." Gareth didn't. He changed channel. The clicking came again, same rhythm. It wasn't loud. It almost sounded like somebody tapping a microphone. Tomasz tried calling the Coast Guard on another channel. His transmission went out normally. No answer at first. Then a voice came back, weak but readable, asking for our position. Gareth gave it. He didn't mention the shadows. He said we were returning early and had some electrical interference. The Coast Guard acknowledged. Respect. While he was talking, the pale glow behind us moved upward. Not fast. It climbed maybe 10 degrees. The second shadows shortened. That was exactly what you would expect if a light source rose higher. So at least the geometry made sense. That somehow made it worse. We could prove the light was real from what the shadows were doing. We just couldn't tell what the light was attached to. Clouds were moving toward it from the west, a long, thin band. The glow stayed beneath them. I could tell because the cloud texture remained visible behind it. For a few seconds, the pale oval seemed sharper. I saw a darker area in the middle. Not black, just less bright. It made the whole thing look almost ring-shaped. Then the cloud reached it. I expected the light to dim. Instead, the cloud itself brightened slightly around the edges. The glow moved into it and vanished. The second shadows disappeared at exactly the same time. Not faded. Gone. All we had left were the ordinary moon shadows. We kept moving. Nobody suggested slowing down. About 10 minutes later, Gareth asked if anyone had noticed the time. I checked my phone. 12:41. That surprised me. I thought it was around midnight. Leon checked his. 12:41. Tomasz said we had left the fishing spot before 12. Gareth checked the GPS track. There was something strange there. Our route showed a straight line northeast for most of the return. Then a loop. A nearly perfect circle about half a mile wide. According to the track, we had spent 22 minutes circling in open water. None of us remembered turning. Gareth's hands had been on the wheel the entire time. He said he had held the same heading. We checked the compass against the GPS. Both looked normal now. The fuel use was higher than expected too. Not massively, but enough to match extra running time. Leon asked if the glow had been with us during the loop. Nobody knew. That conversation died quickly. We were still more than 3 miles from harbor. The clouds thickened overhead and covered the moon. The deck went much darker. Gareth switched on the navigation lights and the small stern lamp. With the moon gone, there should have been no natural shadows, but for maybe 5 seconds after the cloud covered it, I saw my pale second shadow again, very faint, pointing to port. I said nothing. Then Tomasz said, "It's back." So he had seen it too. We all looked up, no glow, no stars through the cloud. The shadow lasted another few seconds, then faded. After that, nothing else happened. The VHF stopped clicking. The compass stayed steady. We reached Newlyn a little after 1. There were people around the harbor, even at that hour. Another boat was unloading nearby. Normal voices, engines, gulls, lights. I had not realized how tense I was until we tied up. We unloaded the fish and cleaned the deck. Gareth kept checking the sky. The cloud had broken enough for the moon to show again. Only one set of shadows. I drove home around 2. My wife, Rachel, was asleep. I left my gear in the utility room and went straight to bed. The next morning, Gareth sent the GPS track to our group chat. The loop was there, almost circular. What bothered me more was the speed data. For most of the trip, we had been doing 7 to 9 knots. During the loop, the GPS showed us slowing to less than 1 knot. Then, for about 11 seconds, it showed 0. Stationary. After that, the speed jumped straight back to 8 knots. Nobody remembered stopping. Tomasz sent the video he had taken of the shadows. Most of it was shaky and dark, but there was one section where you could clearly see his legs and two separate shadows. The stronger one stayed fixed. The pale one slowly rotated across the deck. Near the end, he accidentally pointed the phone upward. For about 2 seconds, the faint glow was visible behind us. It looked smaller on video than I remembered. Just a weak gray point. Then the phone dropped back toward the deck. I watched the clip several times. Right before the glow disappeared into the cloud, something else showed up. There were two pale reflections on the water below it. Side by side, they stayed completely still even though the boat was moving. The next frame showed only one, then none. A week later, Gareth took the boat out during daylight and followed the GPS route. Leon went with him. I didn't. They reached the area where the circular track had been recorded. There was nothing unusual there. Normal depth, no buoy, no submerged obstruction marked on the chart. Gareth stopped the boat near the center of the loop. He said the depth sounder began showing a false bottom about 12 feet below them, even though the actual seabed was more than 200 feet down. The false return lasted around 30 seconds. Then it dropped away. Leon took a picture of the sounder. The image showed the real bottom as a thin line near the bottom of the screen. Above it was a second broad return, flat on top, long enough to fill most of the display. Gareth headed back immediately. When they reached harbor, Leon noticed something on the stainless rail at the stern. 4 small dull marks, each about the size of a fingertip. They were spaced evenly in a line. He tried wiping them off. They weren't dirt. The metal itself had changed color. By the time I saw the boat 2 days later, the marks were still there. At sunset, they looked almost black. Under the harbor lights, each one reflected a faint pale spot onto the deck. 4 small spots, all pointing in the same direction. The first alert came through at 1:12 in the morning. I was sitting at the security desk in the lower level of the museum, drinking vending machine coffee and going through the camera feeds one by one. My shift started at 8 in the evening and ended at 6. Most nights were boring. That was the point. The museum was in Hartford, Connecticut, in an old stone building that had been renovated several times over the years. The public areas were upstairs. The security office, loading dock, staff lockers, mechanical rooms, and storage were all below street level. I had worked there just over 2 years. My name was Marcus Vale. I was 41, married, 2 kids, former corrections officer. I wasn't easily spooked by empty buildings. I had done overnight shifts in places a lot worse than a museum. The alert came from Gallery 6, motion sensor G614. I knew the number because it belonged to one of the sealed cases in the archaeology section. That particular case held a collection of small Bronze Age objects, pins, bits of jewelry, 2 stone tools, and a little bronze figure about the length of my hand. Nothing valuable enough for somebody to plan a movie-style theft over. But the cases had vibration sensors, glass break sensors, magnetic contacts, and internal motion detection. G6-14 was the internal one. It wasn't supposed to activate unless something inside the case moved. I acknowledged the alarm and opened the camera feed. Gallery 6 was empty. Emergency lights were on. Nothing looked wrong. I zoomed in on the case. Everything inside appeared exactly as it had during closing rounds. I called upstairs on the radio. The other guard that night was a guy named Nolan Price. He was doing exterior and upper floor rounds. I asked if he was near Gallery 6. He said he was on the 2nd floor. I told him I had a sensor hit downstairs and was going to check it. He said, "Copy." I took the elevator up. The museum felt different after midnight. During the day, the place was all footsteps and school groups and people coughing and whispering. At night, every little mechanical sound stood out. Ventilation, elevator cables, pipes, the building settling. Gallery 6 was at the end of a long corridor past the Egyptian room. The lights were on low overnight mode. I walked in and checked the case. Nothing. The glass was intact. Locks were secure. No vibration. The objects inside hadn't moved. I leaned close and looked at the motion sensor itself. Small white unit mounted in the top rear corner. Green indicator. Normal. I radioed the desk and cleared the alarm manually from the panel near the staff door. Then I went back downstairs. At 1:19, it happened again. Same sensor, G614. I watched the camera feed for almost a minute before moving. Nothing shifted. The little bronze figure stood in the center where it always did. The pins remained lined up. I called Nolan. He laughed and said maybe we had a mouse in the case. I told him if we had a mouse sealed inside a museum display, we had bigger problems. He asked if I wanted him to check it. I said no. I went back up. Same thing. Nothing. This time I opened the maintenance access panel beneath the case. The electronics were mounted there. No loose wiring, no obvious moisture. I checked the event history on the small diagnostic screen. 2 legitimate detections. Not faults. The system believed something had moved inside. I stood there for a while. Nothing happened. I went back to the desk. At 1:27, the alarm activated a 3rd time. That got irritating. False alarms happened, but 3 hits from the same sealed case in 15 minutes usually meant a failing sensor. I called the on-call facilities technician, a woman named Priya Shah. I didn't expect her to answer, but she did. I explained what was happening. She asked if the detector showed tamper. I said no. She asked about temperature. I checked the environmental panel. Normal. Humidity normal. No nearby HVAC fault. She told me to disable the internal sensor for the night, document it, and put an extra camera watch on the case. That was standard. Before doing that, I enlarged the live camera feed again. That was when I noticed the glass. There was a cloudy patch on the inside. At first, I thought it was glare. I changed camera angles, it stayed. A pale oval patch about halfway up the front pane, maybe 6 inches across. I stared at it. It hadn't been there during my first check. I went upstairs again. The patch was visible in person. It looked like condensation, but only on the inside of the case. The outer glass was dry. The room wasn't humid. I touched the outside surface, cool but not cold enough to fog. I leaned in. The patch was roughly hand-sized, not a handprint. There were no clear fingers, just a shape with a wider lower section and 5 faint extensions at the top. I stepped back. I remember saying, "That's not good." Nolan came over the radio asking if I needed him. I told him yes. While I waited, I watched the patch. It slowly became clearer, not darker, more defined. The center stayed cloudy while the edges sharpened. It looked like someone had breathed against the inside of the glass and pressed a palm there immediately afterward, except nobody could fit inside the case. The case was maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep. Even if somebody had somehow opened it, there wasn't enough space behind the display platform to hide. Nolan arrived a few minutes later. He was younger than me, maybe 27, and usually joked about everything. He stopped joking when he saw the glass. He asked, "Is that inside?" I nodded. He wiped the outside with his sleeve. Nothing changed. We both looked at the objects. Still nothing had moved. Then the sensor activated while we were standing there. A small red indicator flashed inside the case. Nolan actually jumped a little. The alarm tone sounded on my handheld. We stared through the glass. Nothing moved. I mean nothing. Not the bronze figure. Not a loose fiber, not a piece of dust. The detector flashed again, second activation, then stopped. The condensation patch had changed. There were now 5 clearer marks at the top. Finger-sized. Nolan said, "No." I asked what. He pointed. I had already seen it. The patch looked more like a hand now. A small hand. Maybe a child's. I called Priya again. She told me not to open the case. That wasn't something security should do anyway. She said there could be a humidity problem or a cold spot in the glass caused by the internal lighting electronics. I asked how that would make fingers. She didn't answer that directly. She said she was coming in. That made me feel better. We set a temporary barrier around the case and went back to the control room. Nolan stayed downstairs with me. We pulled up all 3 cameras covering Gallery 6. 1 wide shot, 1 angle down the main aisle, 1 aimed directly at the cases. We rolled back the footage to 1:10. At 1:12, the first sensor activation happened. Nothing visible. At 1:19, second activation. Again, nothing. At 1:27, third activation. That was when something changed on camera. Not in the case. Above it. The ceiling darkened, only for a second. There were track lights running across the gallery ceiling and pale acoustic panels between them. Directly above the case, 1 rectangular area became darker than everything around it. Not like a light turning off, more like a shadow passing over the ceiling, except nothing moved beneath the lights. I paused the footage. Nolan leaned closer to the monitor. The dark area was roughly 3 feet wide. It didn't have sharp edges. I advanced frame by frame. It appeared, expanded, then disappeared. Total time was maybe half a second. We checked the other camera. Same thing, different angle. So it wasn't a camera glitch. I looked at the ceiling live. Normal. Nolan said maybe a bird had flown past a skylight. There was no skylight in Gallery 6. It was below another floor. I reminded him. He didn't say anything. We kept watching the recordings. At 1:33, after Nolan arrived, the internal detector flashed while we were both visible on camera. Then the dark patch appeared on the ceiling again. This time it lasted longer. About 2 seconds it seemed to move. Not across the ceiling. Down it. I know that sounds wrong. The shadow looked like it stretched from the ceiling toward the top of the display case. There was nothing physically connecting the two, but the darkness narrowed as it approached the case, like a vertical shape seen from an angle. Then it vanished. Right after that, the hand-shaped condensation became visible. Nolan said we should call the police. I asked what we would tell them. He said, "I don't know. Somebody's in there." I pointed at the live feed. The gallery was empty. He said he didn't mean a person. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. At around 1:45, we heard a knock. 3 taps. From the speaker connected to the Gallery 6 microphone. The museum cameras had audio in some areas for after-hours incident review. I turned the volume up. Nothing. Then 3 more taps. Very light. Nolan asked if it was pipes. I said maybe. Then we heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The waveform on the recording showed each sound clearly. It came from the gallery. I switched through microphones. Strongest signal was camera 6A. That camera sat about 15 feet from the display case. Nolan and I went upstairs together. The tapping stopped before we reached the room. Gallery 6 looked normal. We checked the walls, ceiling, floor, other cases, nothing. Then I noticed a thin line of condensation forming on the inside of the glass. Not the hand-shaped patch. This was lower. It began near the bottom of the pane and slowly moved upward. I watched it grow. It looked like a trail left by a fingertip, a single narrow line. It stopped about halfway up. Then another appeared beside it. Nolan whispered, "Marcus." I told him I saw it. 3 more lines formed, 5 total, all vertical. They ended underneath the cloudy hand shape. It looked as though fingers had dragged upward from the bottom of the glass. I radioed the control room even though nobody was there. Habit. Then I remembered Priya was on her way and called her mobile. She said she was 10 minutes out. I told her the condition had changed. She asked if the case temperature had dropped. I checked the wall panel nearby. The room was 68 degrees. Case interior sensor, 68.4. Humidity, 43%. Completely normal. Nolan shined his flashlight through the side glass. The beam reflected off the artifacts. For a second, I thought I saw something move behind the bronze figure. Just a darker patch. I leaned closer. Nothing. Nolan asked if I had seen it. I said I wasn't sure. Then the entire case made a soft sound. Not a bang, more like pressure shifting. A low creak from the glass. We stepped back. The motion detector flashed. Once, twice, 3 times. The handprint became darker. The 5 streaks below it widened. Then everything stopped. The gallery went quiet. A second later, the emergency lighting dimmed. Not off, just lower. My radio gave a burst of static. Nolan tried his. Same. We both looked toward the ceiling. The dark patch was there. We could see it without cameras now, a soft blackening directly above the case. At first I thought a light fixture was failing. Then I realized the darkness extended beyond the fixture. It covered part of the ceiling tile and crossed over the metal track. It slowly widened. There was no movement around us, no airflow, no sound. The patch darkened until I couldn't see the texture of the ceiling underneath. It looked flat, then the edge moved. It came toward us maybe a foot. I backed up. Nolan did too. The darkness stopped. Something tapped inside the case. Once, a small hard sound, like a fingernail against glass. Then again, higher. Then again, higher still. The taps moved upward behind the handprint. I had the very strong feeling that something inside the case was standing up. That made no physical sense, but that was what the sound suggested. I told Nolan we were leaving the gallery. We backed through the doorway. I pulled the security door shut. The moment it latched, the dark area on the ceiling disappeared. The emergency lights returned to normal brightness. Our radios cleared. We waited in the corridor. Nothing else happened for several minutes. Priya arrived at 2:03. We met her at the employee entrance. She brought a thermal camera, humidity meter, and a hard case of tools. We showed her the footage first. She watched the ceiling darken twice, then she watched the handprint appear. She didn't make jokes. She asked us both whether anyone had entered the case during the day. No. Only collection staff had keys, and the access log showed no opening since the previous week. We returned to Gallery 6. The condensation was fading. The hand shape was still visible but lighter. Priya scanned the glass with the thermal camera. Temperature was uniform. She scanned the ceiling, normal. Then she pointed the camera at the inside of the case. She stopped moving. I asked what she saw. She handed me the display. There was a cold area inside the case, not on an object, in empty space, a vertical patch just behind the glass. It showed about 8 degrees colder than the surrounding air. I asked if that was possible. Priya said, "Not like that." The cold area was narrow at the top and wider lower down. She moved the camera slightly. It stayed in the same physical spot. Then it disappeared. The internal motion detector activated immediately. Priya lowered the camera. The bronze figure had turned. Only a little, maybe 10 degrees, but all three of us saw it. Its front had been facing slightly left. Now it faced more toward the glass. Nobody had touched the case. Nolan said, "We're done." Priya agreed. She disabled the case electronics completely. Motion sensor, internal lighting, everything. We placed the gallery on restricted access until morning. The rest of the night stayed quiet. I finished my shift in the control room with the Gallery 6 feed enlarged on one monitor. Nothing else moved. At 6, the day crew arrived. Collections staff opened the case around 7:30. I stayed because I wanted to see what they found. There was no water inside, no moisture source, no damaged seal, no loose wiring. The motion detector tested normally. The bronze figure had no marks underneath it suggesting it had slid. They reset it to the catalog position. One of the conservators cleaned the inside of the glass. The handprint came off. She said it was just condensation residue. Then she stopped wiping. There was another mark above it, much fainter, near the very top of the pane. It was shaped like 4 fingertips pressed against the inside. No palm, just 4 pale oval marks. They were almost 7 feet above the floor, higher than anyone could have reached from inside the case, even if the display platform had been removed. I went home around 8:30. My wife was already getting the kids ready for school. I didn't tell them much. I slept until early afternoon. When I woke up, I had 3 missed calls from Nolan. I called him back. He was still at the museum. He told me facilities had pulled more footage. Not from Gallery 6, from the hallway camera outside it. At 1:31, 2 minutes before Nolan had joined me upstairs, the camera showed me walking past the gallery entrance toward the security elevator. The problem was I had been downstairs at the desk at 1:31. Nolan was on camera in the second floor corridor at the same time. I told him to send me a still. He did. The image was grainy. The person had my uniform, my build, my short haircut. He was walking away from the camera, so there was no face. In the frame where he passed Gallery 6, the ceiling lights above him dimmed. The next frame showed the corridor empty. There was nowhere between those 2 positions where he could have turned off. I woke up because something was walking on the gravel outside my bedroom window. It was around 3:30 in the morning, maybe a little later. I didn't check the time right away. I was half asleep, and at first I thought it was a cat or a fox. My house was on the edge of a small village in North Yorkshire. It wasn't completely isolated, but there were fields behind the back garden and only 3 houses on our side of the lane. I lived there with my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, but they were away that weekend visiting Sarah's parents in Leeds. So I was alone. The bedroom was upstairs at the back of the house. Below the window, there was a narrow strip of gravel running along the wall, then the lawn, then a wooden fence about 30 feet away. The crunching sound came again, slow. 1 step, pause, another step. It was heavier than a cat. I lay there listening. The house was completely quiet, apart from the boiler making its usual little clicking sound downstairs. Then the gravel crunched directly under the window. I sat up. My first thought was burglar. I reached for my phone and looked at the screen. 3:37. I turned the brightness down before getting out of bed. I don't know why I did that. I suppose I didn't want anyone outside seeing the light come on. I walked to the window and moved the curtain a few inches. There was nobody there. The garden was dark, but not completely black. There was a street lamp farther down the lane, and the sky had that pale gray look you sometimes get before rain. I could see the gravel. Nothing on it. I could see the lawn. Nothing there either. I stood still for maybe 20 seconds. Then I heard another crunch. This one was to the left of the window. I leaned closer to the glass. Still nobody. I started wondering if the sound was coming from the wall itself. Pipes. Expansion. Something like that. Then I noticed the grass. About 6 feet out from the house, there was a dark patch in the lawn. At first, I thought it was just wet. Then I realized the grass was flattened, not in a circle, more like two narrow areas side by side. They looked almost like footprints, except much larger and less defined. I stared at them. The grass around the patches was standing normally. The flattened parts looked fresh, like someone had just stepped down and was still putting weight there. I opened the curtain a little wider. Nothing was standing on the lawn. I could see straight through the space above the depression. There was no person, no animal, no object. But the grass was pressed down. I remember rubbing my eyes because I genuinely thought I was seeing it wrong. The patch stayed there. I picked up my glasses from the bedside table and put them on. It didn't change. The grass was definitely bent. Then the right-hand patch lifted, not all at once. The blades slowly came back up. At almost the same moment, another patch appeared about 2 feet farther toward the fence. The grass folded downward. I froze. A second later, the left patch did the same thing. Lifted, then appeared farther ahead. It looked like footsteps, slow footsteps, moving across my lawn. There was nothing making them. I backed away from the window. For a few seconds, I stood beside the bed trying to work out what I had seen. I told myself it had to be wind. There had been strong wind earlier in the evening, but the trees weren't moving, the hedge wasn't moving, and wind didn't press grass down in two separate spots. I went back to the window. The depressions had moved farther away. They were almost halfway across the lawn. Each one appeared, stayed down for maybe 2 seconds, then rose as the next one formed ahead. The spacing was roughly what you would expect from someone walking normally. I watched 4 more steps. They angled slightly toward the right side of the garden, toward the shed. I thought maybe there was an animal I couldn't see because of the darkness. A deer. Something low to the ground. I used the flashlight on my phone and pointed it through the glass. The beam reflected badly, so I opened the window. Cold air came in. There was a faint smell of damp soil. I pointed the light at the lawn. The flattened patches were clearly visible. Nothing was standing above them. The next one appeared while I was shining the light directly at it. The grass folded down. I almost dropped the phone. I shut the window. I didn't know what else to do. I considered calling the police, but I could already imagine trying to explain it. Something invisible was walking across the grass. They would have thought I was drunk. I hadn't been drinking. I went downstairs. That was probably stupid, but I wanted a better view. The kitchen had French doors facing the garden. I left all the lights off. I took the heavy torch we kept in a drawer near the back door. The whole time I was moving through the house, I could hear very faint sounds outside. Not footsteps anymore. Just occasional soft rustling. When I reached the kitchen, I crouched slightly and looked through the glass. The lawn was empty. I couldn't immediately see the depressions. I thought maybe it had stopped. Then something touched the shed. There was a soft wooden creak. The shed sat at the far right corner of the garden. Its door was closed with a metal latch. I watched it. Nothing moved. Then the latch lifted, only slightly, maybe half an inch. It dropped. I stepped back from the door. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The latch lifted again, this time higher. It stayed up for a second, then it fell. The shed door didn't open. I pointed the torch through the glass and switched it on. The beam lit the whole corner of the garden. Nothing. I could see the fence, the shed, the compost bin, the wet grass. There was nobody there. I turned the torch off. Almost immediately, something moved across the gravel beside the house. Crunch, 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 crunch. Fast this time. I spun toward the side window. The sound stopped. I stood completely still. Then I heard 3 light taps against the kitchen window. Not the door, the small window over the sink. Tap, tap, tap. I did not go closer. I stayed near the table. There were no trees near that window, no hanging branches, nothing that should have touched it. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard a dragging sound on the outside wall. It moved downward, then stopped. I called Sarah. She answered after several rings, sounding half asleep. I told her there was something in the garden. She asked if I had seen someone. I said no. She asked if I wanted her to call the police. I said, I don't know. She could tell I was frightened. She told me to lock the doors and go upstairs. I said I had already locked everything. While I was speaking to her, something pressed down on the grass directly outside the kitchen doors. I saw it happen. A large patch flattened. Not 2 footprints this time, one broad area, about the size of a person crouching. I stopped talking. Sarah asked what was wrong. The grass stayed pressed down. I could see water shining on the blades around it. Then a second patch formed closer to the house. The first one rose. The second stayed. Whatever it was seemed to have moved forward. I told Sarah I was going upstairs. She said she was staying on the phone. I didn't argue. I went back to the bedroom. I locked the bedroom door, which I had never done before. From upstairs, I could see most of the garden again. The moving depressions were back near the middle of the lawn. They were heading toward the fence now, not toward the house. That made me feel slightly better. I watched them move. Step, pause. Step, pause. There was something strange about the rhythm. It was too regular, took almost exactly the same amount of time. I started counting. 1, 2, 3. Each new depression formed on 3. I stopped counting. The pattern continued anyway. When it reached the fence, the grass stayed down for longer. Maybe 10 seconds. I expected the fence to shake. It didn't. Then I heard a sound like someone running a hand along the wooden boards. A dry scraping noise. It moved from left to right. The depression vanished. The lawn slowly returned to normal. I stayed by the window. Nothing happened. Sarah was still on the phone. She asked if I could see anything. I told her no. She wanted me to call the police anyway. I said I would if it came back. For the next 20 minutes, there was nothing. Then the security light at the side of the house came on. It was motion activated. The light shone across the gravel path. Nobody was there. It stayed on for about 30 seconds. Went off. 5 seconds later, it came on again. Then off. Then on. Always with the same delay. Something was moving back and forth beside the house. I went into the spare room at the front and looked down toward the driveway. The gravel there was empty. The lane beyond it was empty too. The street lamp flickered once. Then I noticed a dark shape near the front gate. Not a person, more like a vertical patch where the background looked slightly darker. I thought it was a shadow from the hedge. I moved my head. The shape didn't line up with anything. It was about 5 feet tall, maybe 6. Very narrow. I looked away for a second to check whether Sarah was still on the call. When I looked back, it was closer to the house. Not much, maybe 3 feet. I didn't see it move. I just knew it hadn't been there before. I stopped looking through the glass. I shut the curtains. I sat on the floor against the wall with the phone beside me. Sarah kept talking. She told me about what our daughter had done that day. Just normal stuff. I think she was trying to keep me calm. I listened. About 10 minutes later, there was a sound on the roof. One dull step, then another. I looked up. The footsteps crossed above the bedroom. Slowly, they stopped directly overhead. I could hear a faint pressure sound from the ceiling. Wood settling. Then silence. I stayed on the floor. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 15 minutes. Maybe more. Eventually, Sarah said she was going to drive back. I told her not to. It was more than an hour away, and I didn't want her coming to the house while I didn't know what was outside. We agreed she would wait until daylight. The roof stayed quiet. Around 4:40, I heard the first car go down the lane. A delivery van, probably. That normal engine sound was the first thing that made the house feel ordinary again. A few minutes later, birds started making noise in the hedge. By 5, the sky was getting lighter. I looked outside. Nothing. The lawn looked normal from upstairs. I waited until almost 6 before going outside. I took the torch even though I didn't need it anymore. The gravel below the bedroom window had been disturbed. There were shallow marks in it. Not footprints, just little areas where the stones had shifted. The grass had several flattened patches. They were already lifting. I followed them across the lawn. They ended at the fence. There was no damage to the wood, no broken boards, no mud, nothing on the other side except a narrow strip of weeds and then the field. I opened the gate and walked around. The field grass was wet with dew. There were no tracks leading away. I checked the shed. The latch was still closed. Inside, everything was normal. When Sarah came home later that morning, I showed her the patches in the lawn. Most of them were almost gone by then. She could see a few. She asked if maybe someone had been messing around in the garden. I said I didn't know. We checked the security camera over the front door. It had recorded the side light coming on 3 times. The camera covered part of the driveway and the front gate. At 4:11, the light activated. Nothing entered the frame. At 4:12, it activated again. Still nothing. At 4:13, the picture went slightly blurry for about 4 seconds. Not black, just out of focus. Then it cleared. There was no dark shape by the gate. I watched the clip several times. Right before the blur, the hedge branches nearest the gate bent inward. Not much, just a few inches. There was no wind. I spent the rest of the day doing normal things around the house. I repaired a loose fence board. I cut the grass even though it didn't really need it. That evening, Sarah and our daughter went upstairs early. I stayed downstairs watching television. At about 10, I went outside to put the bins by the lane. Nothing happened. The garden looked completely ordinary. I slept badly, but didn't hear anything. The next morning I went to work. When I came home, Sarah was in the kitchen. She asked if I had moved one of the garden chairs before leaving. I said no. We kept 2 metal chairs against the back wall. One was still there. The other was halfway across the lawn. It was standing upright. There were no drag marks behind it. The grass around all 4 legs was pressed flat, and beside the chair there were 2 deeper patches in the lawn, side by side, facing the bedroom window. I was driving south on the A2 near Cushendon when I first saw the lights coming down over the water. It was just after 6 in the evening in late October, and I was heading home after visiting my sister in Ballycastle. I lived outside Belfast at the time, so I knew I had a long drive ahead of me. I had taken the coast road because I liked it better than going inland, even though it was slower. The weather had been decent when I left my sister's place, but by the time I got past Tor Head, there was a low gray cloud sitting over the sea and a thin mist blowing across the road. There wasn't much traffic. I remember that clearly because I had been listening to a podcast and kept noticing how empty everything felt whenever the talking stopped. There were stretches where I could see headlights far behind me, but then I would go around another bend and be completely alone again. The sea was on my left, dark and flat-looking under the cloud. The first thing that caught my attention was a white light high over the water. At first, I assumed it was an aircraft coming toward one of the airports farther south. I saw planes all the time from where I lived, so there was nothing strange about it. The light was bright enough to stand out through the mist, and there were 2 smaller lights beside it, one red and one that looked pale green. That made it look even more normal. I watched it for a few seconds whenever the road straightened out. It seemed to be descending. I remember thinking it was surprisingly low for being that far offshore. I couldn't judge the distance properly, but it looked like maybe a couple of kilometers out. Probably more. It was difficult to tell with nothing around it for scale. A minute or 2 later, I reached a lay-by overlooking the water. I nearly drove past it. Then I saw the aircraft again and actually said, "What are you doing?" out loud because it looked far too low. I pulled in. There was nobody else there. I left the engine running and lowered my window a little. The wind was cold enough that I raised it again almost immediately. The object was descending toward the sea at a shallow angle. From that distance, it looked roughly like an ordinary passenger aircraft seen from the front and slightly to the side. There was a bright white light near the front and dimmer lights farther apart behind it, but I couldn't see the actual body very well. That was the first thing that bothered me. Normally, even at dusk, you could make out some part of an aircraft against the sky. A wing, a tail, something reflecting light. With this, I saw lights and a dark area between them, but the outline kept seeming wrong. I thought the cloud or mist was hiding it. It came lower. I became convinced I was about to watch an aircraft land on the water. That sounds ridiculous now, but that was honestly what I thought. I wondered if there had been an emergency. I reached for my phone before anything had even happened because I thought I might need to call someone. Then the object leveled out. It was only a few meters above the sea. I couldn't give an exact height, maybe 5 meters, maybe 15. But it was low enough that I expected some kind of disturbance below it. There wasn't any. The water underneath stayed flat. The object continued south, moving parallel to the coastline. It was slow. That was the part that made me stop thinking I was looking at a normal plane. It had been descending at what seemed like aircraft speed, but once it reached the water, it slowed down so much that I could follow it easily with my eyes. It looked as though it were traveling at maybe 40 or 50 miles an hour, possibly slower. There was no spray behind it, no wake, no visible exhaust. I opened the car door and stepped outside because I thought the windscreen might be distorting what I was seeing. The sound of the sea became louder, along with the wind coming around the car. I expected to hear engines. I heard nothing from the object. I stood beside the driver's door with my phone in my hand and watched it continue along the water. The lights were steady, no flashing. That was another thing I noticed. The red and greenish lights stayed on continuously instead of blinking like navigation lights usually did. The white one was much brighter and seemed to shine forward, although I never saw a beam on the water. I tried filming it. My phone camera was terrible in low light, and on the screen it just looked like 3 blurry dots over black water. I stopped recording after about 20 seconds. Then something happened that made me get back into the car. A second light appeared behind me. Not behind the object. Behind me, up near the hillside, on the other side of the road. It was small and white and low enough that I initially thought somebody with a torch was walking through the field. I turned around. There was a steep, grassy slope with a fence running along it. I couldn't see any person. The light moved sideways about 30 meters, stopped, then went out. I waited. Nothing. I looked back toward the sea. The larger object was still moving south. I got into the car and locked the doors. I knew how silly that was, since I was sitting in a lay-by beside a public road, but I suddenly felt very exposed. I opened a flight tracking app. I used it fairly often because my dad had been obsessed with aircraft and had got me into checking what was flying overhead. I zoomed out until I could see most of the north coast. There were several flights, one over the North Channel farther east, another heading toward Belfast, a couple much farther away, nothing offshore in front of me. I refreshed it, nothing. I knew not every aircraft appeared on those apps, so that alone didn't mean much. Military flights disappeared all the time. Private aircraft sometimes did too. But this thing looked too big to be something like a helicopter, and it was traveling just above the water. I checked the maritime tracking app I had on my phone as well. My brother worked on ferries, so I had that one too. There were vessels farther out, nothing anywhere near the lights. While I was looking down at my phone, my car radio stopped. Not static, it simply went silent. The display still showed the station and the volume level. I turned the knob, nothing happened. I switched stations, still nothing. Then there was a soft clicking sound from somewhere behind the dashboard. 3 clicks, pause, 3 more. I turned the radio off. The clicking continued for maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I remember sitting there with both hands on the steering wheel, even though I wasn't moving. The larger object had traveled farther south by then. The mist had thickened over the water, but I could still see the 3 lights. I decided to leave. As I pulled back onto the road, I looked toward the hillside again. The small white light was back. This time it was farther up. It stayed still while I drove past. I kept telling myself it was somebody checking sheep. That explanation worked until I went around the next bend and saw another white light ahead of me. It was on the roadside, maybe 200 meters away. I slowed down because I thought it was a cyclist. The light moved off the road before I reached it, not toward the grass, upward, only by a few meters. Then it went out. I actually stopped the car in the middle of the road. There was nobody behind me. I waited for something to come out of the ditch or for a person to appear. Nothing did. I drove on. For the next 10 minutes, I kept seeing the object over the sea whenever the road opened toward the coast. It stayed low the entire time. Sometimes the mist hid it completely. Then I would come around another bend and see those steady lights again, moving in the same direction as me. After a while, I realized we were traveling at nearly the same speed. If I slowed down, it moved ahead. If I drove faster, I caught up with it. That made it feel less like I was watching something far offshore and more like it was accompanying me. I didn't like that thought, so I stopped looking toward the sea. A few kilometers later, my phone rang through the car speakers. The sudden sound made me jump. It was my sister, Orla. I answered. She asked if I had left my scarf at her house. I said probably, and then I told her I had seen something strange over the water. She asked what kind of strange. I said, I think there's a plane flying about 10 feet above the sea. She laughed at first, then she realized I wasn't joking. I tried to explain what I had seen. While I was speaking, the phone connection began breaking up. Orla's voice became stretched and metallic. Then I heard my own voice come back through the speakers. Not an echo exactly. It was delayed by several seconds. I heard myself saying, it slowed down before it touched the water, after I had already moved on to another sentence. I stopped talking. For a moment, all I could hear was breathing through the connection. I said, Orla? The call disconnected. My phone showed full signal. I tried calling her again. It failed immediately. I started driving faster. By then, it was almost fully dark. The road was wet from the mist, and I had my headlights on full beam whenever there was no traffic coming toward me. A car finally appeared behind me. I felt relieved when I saw the headlights. It sounds stupid, but I did. I slowed slightly so they could catch up. They never did. The lights stayed the same distance behind me for several minutes. Then I reached a long, straight section and looked in the mirror. There was no car, just one white light. It seemed too high. I couldn't see two headlights anymore, only one. I stared at it longer than I should have. The light rose slowly above the road, not quickly. It just climbed until it was level with the tops of the trees. Then my road dipped down and I lost sight of it. I had stopped trying to explain things by then. I just wanted to get somewhere with houses. Near Carnlow, I started seeing more traffic, and that helped. A van passed in the opposite direction. Then, two cars. There were lights in windows along the road. I pulled into a petrol station that was still open. I parked under the bright canopy and stayed in the car for a minute. My hands were shaking enough that I had trouble plugging my phone into the charger. I called Orla again. This time she answered immediately. Before I could say anything, she asked where I had been. I told her I was near Carnlough. She said, "No, where have you been for the last hour?" I thought she meant the bad connection. I told her I had been driving. She said our call had ended at 6:22. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 7:41. That didn't make sense to me. I had left the lay-by sometime after 6. I knew the coast road was slow, but there was no way that much time had passed. I checked my phone. 7:41. I opened the map. My location history had a gap. There was a point north of Cushendon and another near Carnlough, but nothing in between. I told Orla I must have lost track of time. She asked if I was okay to drive. I said yes. I went into the petrol station and bought coffee, even though I didn't really want it. The guy behind the counter was maybe in his 20s. His name badge said Jamie. While he was making change, I asked if he had heard anything about an aircraft having trouble offshore. He looked confused. I said I had seen something flying very low over the sea. He glanced toward the windows and said there had been weird lights out there about half an hour earlier. I asked what kind. He shrugged and said he had thought it was a helicopter. Then he added, but it didn't sound like one. I didn't tell him anything else. I sat in the car until another vehicle pulled out heading south, then followed it. For the rest of the drive, I stayed behind other traffic whenever I could. I didn't see the object again until I was much closer to Belfast. It happened only once. I was on a wider road by then, with streetlights and houses around me. I had started feeling stupid about how frightened I'd been. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. Far behind the car, above the road, there were 3 lights, one bright white, one red, one pale green. They stayed perfectly level with each other. I watched them for a few seconds. A bus moved between us. When it changed lanes, the lights were gone. I reached home a little after 9. My neighbor, Denise, was outside putting recycling bins near the pavement. She asked why the front of my car was covered in salt. I looked at it. There was a thin white film across the bonnet and windscreen. I told her I had driven along the coast. She said, "Must have been rough out there." I said it hadn't been. The sea had been almost flat. Inside, I checked the video I had taken from the lay-by. Most of it was useless. Dark water, wind noise, shaky lights. But near the end, when I had lowered the phone, there were 4 lights instead of 3. The extra one was high above the others. It stayed visible for less than 2 seconds. I watched the clip several times. Then I checked the timestamp. The video was 23 seconds long. According to the file information, it had been created at 6:14 p.m. The next photo on my phone had been taken at 7:26. I didn't remember taking it. It was almost completely black. I increased the brightness. The picture showed part of my dashboard, the passenger side window, and beyond that, the sea. There was a pale shape over the water. Not a clear object, just a long, dark form with a faint white edge. It looked close enough that I should have remembered stopping to photograph it. I checked the location data. The photo had GPS coordinates attached. They placed me on the coast road roughly 12 miles south of the lay-by. I had no memory of stopping there. I didn't delete the picture. A few weeks later, I drove that route again in daylight. I found the section of road where the coordinates pointed. There was nowhere to pull over. On one side, there was a rock wall. On the other, there was a metal barrier above the sea. I drove past twice to make sure. There was no lay-by, driveway, or side road. When I got home, I opened the photo again. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the lower corner, reflected faintly in the passenger window, there was a small white light. It wasn't outside over the sea. It seemed to be behind the car. The first bag fell at 2:17 in the morning. I knew the time because I had just checked the clock over the mixing station to see how far behind I was. I worked nights at a small bakery outside Duluth, Minnesota. It wasn't one of those nice little places with chalkboards and exposed brick. It was mostly a production kitchen attached to a storefront. Stainless steel tables, 2 commercial ovens, a walk-in cooler, racks of sheet pans, bins of flour and sugar, and a radio that only picked up 3 stations clearly after midnight. My shift usually started at 10. By 2, I was normally alone. The owner, Martin, came in around 4:30, and the first counter person arrived at 5. Between those times, the whole place was mine. That night had been colder than usual for early November. There was freezing rain outside, and every time I went near the back door, I could hear little bits of ice hitting the metal vent cover. The building itself was warm because both ovens had been running since midnight. I was shaping sourdough loaves when I heard something slide behind me, then a soft thump. A 5-pound paper bag of rye flour had fallen off the lowest storage shelf. It wasn't a big deal. The bag hadn't split. I picked it up and put it back. That shelf sat against the wall beside the ovens. We kept smaller bags there because the big 50-pound sacks were stored in plastic bins closer to the mixer. I checked the shelf because I figured it was uneven. It wasn't. The bag sat flat. I went back to work. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Slide. Thump. Same bag. This time it landed on its side and puffed a little flour through a crease near the top. I stood there looking at it for a few seconds. The ovens vibrated slightly when the burners kicked on, but not enough to move anything. I had worked there almost 3 years, and I had never seen a bag walk itself off a shelf. I put it farther back. Then I pushed the other bags around it so it couldn't move. I remember saying, "Stay there," because talking to objects was pretty normal when you worked alone all night. I cleaned the flour off the floor and kept going. Nothing happened for a while. I loaded 2 trays of croissants into the smaller oven, checked the timer, and started weighing dough for sandwich rolls. At about 2:35, I noticed flour on the floor again. Not a pile, just a dusting. It was directly under the shelf. I thought the rye bag had started leaking, so I picked it up and inspected it. There was a tiny split in one corner, but the flour on the floor wasn't directly underneath it. It was about a foot to the right. I wiped the shelf with my hand. Dry, no draft. The ventilation hood above the ovens was running, but the airflow pulled upward. Nothing was blowing sideways. I pinched the tier in the bag shut with a binder clip and put it back. Then I swept again. That should have been the end of it. A few minutes later, while I was facing the mixer, I saw something white falling at the edge of my vision. I turned. A narrow stream of flour was dropping from the shelf. Not from a bag. It looked like flour was spilling out from the gap between two bags, except when I walked over and moved them apart, there was nothing there. The flour stopped. I checked both bags. Neither had a hole. I looked underneath the shelf. Nothing. Then I looked up at the ceiling because I wondered if something was coming down from above. The ceiling was clean. I stood there listening. The bakery had a lot of normal nighttime sounds, the mixer motor, the ovens clicking, the compressors in the cooler, the old pipes knocking when somebody upstairs used water. We rented the building, and there were 2 apartments over the shop. That night, I could hear the refrigeration units running in the back and the steady hum of the ovens. Nothing else. I went back to the table. Less than a minute later, the flour started falling again. This time I watched it. A fine stream came off the front edge of the shelf. It fell maybe 3 feet and landed on the tile. The strange part was that it didn't fall straight down. It seemed to hit something halfway. The flour changed direction, only slightly, like it was running over the edge of something I couldn't see. I walked closer. The stream stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. I moved back to the table. It started again. At that point, I was irritated more than scared. I thought there had to be some stupid explanation. Static, heat, a mouse, anything. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam showed dust floating in the air, but nothing near the shelf. I moved the bags one at a time and inspected every seam. No holes. Then I pulled the whole shelf away from the wall. Nothing was behind it except an electrical conduit and a lot of old crumbs. I put everything back. The refrigerator compressor shut off. That happened all the time. But when it did, the room got much quieter than I expected. I hadn't realized how loud it had been. I could hear the rain outside. I could hear the fan in the oven. I could hear my own shoes squeaking slightly when I shifted my weight. Then I heard a tapping noise. 3 taps. Very soft. It came from beside the ovens. I stared at the wall. There was maybe 4 feet between the right side of the larger oven and the storage shelf. We kept a narrow rolling rack there sometimes, but that night the space was empty. The tapping came again. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. I walked over. Nothing. I checked the side panel of the oven. Hot, obviously. No loose metal. I even crouched and looked underneath. That was when flour started falling behind me. I stood up fast. A new stream had started from the top shelf. This one was heavier. There was definitely no damaged bag up there. I had checked them. The flour fell in a thin line, hit empty air about 5 feet above the floor and spread. That was when I stopped feeling annoyed. I watched flour catch on something. There was no other way to describe it. The powder landed on an invisible surface. A little of it stuck. Most slid off. At first, it looked like a patch, maybe the size of my hand. Then more flour fell. It spread lower. I backed up. There was an outline. Not a full outline, just places where the white powder was collecting. A sloping line, then a corner, then another line below it. I thought maybe there was plastic hanging there, clear plastic. We used plastic sheeting sometimes when Martin had maintenance work done. I reached out. My hand passed through empty air. The flour dropped to the floor. I pulled my hand back. Nothing touched me. I stood there trying to understand what I had just seen. Then the flour started falling from 2 places at once. One stream came off the upper shelf. Another came from lower down. Both hit the same invisible area. The upper flour traced something narrow and vertical. The lower stream caught on a wider section. The shape was standing right beside the oven. I could see where the flour bent around it. I remember thinking it looked roughly human-sized. That thought was so unpleasant that I immediately rejected it. It was probably heat moving the powder. That was what I told myself. Hot air rises. The ovens were hot. Fine powder could behave strangely. I watched flour gather along a line that looked like a shoulder, then another line lower down about where an elbow might have been. I stepped backward until I hit the mixing table. The shape didn't move. The flour kept falling. More of it collected. Not enough to make a clear figure. just edges. Little white marks suspended for a second before dropping. I could see a blank space between them. Something about 6 feet tall, maybe taller, standing sideways to me. I turned off the nearest oven. I don't know why. I thought if heat was causing it, shutting the oven down would change something. The burner cut off. The fan kept running. The flour continued. I pulled my phone out and started recording. On the screen, it looked much less obvious. Just flour falling in a strange pattern. I moved closer. The flour shifted. Not the stream, the blank space. It seemed to lean away from me. I stopped. A line of powder slid downward through the air in a curve. I could suddenly see what looked like the outer edge of a head. Not details. No face. Nothing like that. Just flour following a rounded surface before dropping. I nearly walked out then. I actually took 2 steps toward the back door. But my coat was in the break room, my keys were by the register, and freezing rain was coming down outside. Also, some stupid part of my brain kept telling me I was overreacting. I had been awake since 9 the previous morning. I was tired. Maybe my eyes were doing something weird. I turned on every overhead light. The shape stayed there. The lights made it easier to see the flour. That was worse. The powder landed, stuck briefly, then slipped away. Some of it seemed to hang in places that made no physical sense. Around chest height, I could see a shallow curve. Lower down, there was a vertical gap where flour didn't fall normally. The floor had begun collecting an outline too. Most of the flour landed around 2 empty spaces near the base, like something was blocking it. 2 narrow areas, about where feet would be. I said, "Hello?" I hated myself for saying it the second the word came out. Nothing happened. I waited. Then there was a sound from inside the bakery. Not the kitchen, the storefront, a soft scrape. I looked through the open doorway. The front was dark except for the emergency light near the exit. The chairs were upside down on the tables. No one was there. The scrape came again. Something dragged lightly across the tile. I grabbed the wooden handle of a bench scraper. That was completely useless, but it was the closest thing in reach. I walked into the storefront. The front door was locked. The deadbolt was still turned. The windows were black with reflections. I checked behind the counter. Nothing. When I came back into the kitchen, the flour had stopped falling. The space beside the oven looked empty. I stood in the doorway and stared at it. Then a handprint appeared on the stainless steel side of the oven. Not all at once. 5 clean lines formed slowly through the flour dust on the metal. I had dusted the side earlier without noticing. Something removed the flour. That was what it looked like. 5 narrow tracks. Then part of a palm. The print was higher than my shoulder. I didn't go near it. I backed away. The bakery was completely quiet now. I realized the walk-in cooler had stopped too. So had the freezer. Both compressors had gone silent. That wasn't normal. They cycled independently. They never shut off at the exact same time. The fans inside them had stopped as well. Even the radio had gone silent. The display was still lit. The room felt wrong without the mechanical noise. I could hear a faint sound near the ovens, a breathing sound. That was my first thought. Slow, wet, in out. I held my own breath. The sound continued. I turned toward it. More flour dropped from the shelf. This time it fell across the upper part of the shape. A broad section appeared for maybe 2 seconds. There was a narrow place at the top, then something wider below. The proportions weren't quite right. The top looked too small or maybe too far forward. I couldn't tell. The flour slid away almost immediately. But the blank area moved. It turned toward me. I knew it turned because the flour that had been outlining one side suddenly broke apart and started catching on a different edge. I took another step backward. My hip hit the table. A tray rattled. The breathing sound stopped. I didn't move. Neither did the shape. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, one of the flour bags on the top shelf compressed inward, slowly, like somebody had put a hand against it. The paper wrinkled. The bag shifted back. Another bag beside it moved. I watched an indentation travel across the front. 4 separate pressure marks. Then a 5th. They lifted. The bag returned to shape. I remember whispering, "No." The flour on the floor moved, just a little. A narrow track appeared through it. Then another. Closer to me, I moved around the mixing table. Another track formed. There was no visible foot. The powder simply pushed aside. I ran to the back door. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't grab my keys. I pulled the door open and stepped into the alley. Freezing rain hit my face immediately. I stood under the little metal awning and looked back through the doorway. Nothing followed me. The kitchen looked normal from outside. Bright lights, stainless steel, racks, ovens. I stayed there for maybe 2 minutes. My shirt started getting wet. I realized my car keys were still inside. My phone was still recording in my hand. I called Martin. He didn't answer. I called again. Voicemail. I called my coworker Lydia even though I knew she was asleep. She answered on the third try. I told her the refrigerators had stopped and something weird was happening with the flour. I didn't tell her about the shape. I couldn't make myself say it. She asked if I smelled gas. I said no. She told me to call Martin. I said I had. While we were talking, I heard a loud mechanical clunk from inside. The refrigeration units restarted. Both of them. The freezer compressor kicked on first, then the cooler. The fans spun up. The radio started playing at the same moment. Music came through the kitchen doorway. I looked inside. The flour dropped. All of it. Every bit that had been hanging or collecting on whatever was beside the ovens fell straight to the floor. The shape vanished. There was nothing there. No outline. No disturbance. Just a pile of flour. I stayed outside another minute. Then I went back in. I left the door open behind me. I checked the handprint on the oven. It was still there. I took a picture. I got my keys. Then I sat in my car in the alley with the engine running until Martin finally called me back. I told him the refrigeration had gone out. That part was true. He came in early. By then, I had gone back inside because I couldn't leave the ovens unattended. I didn't stand near the shelf. I worked from the other side of the room. Martin arrived a little after 3:30. The first thing he noticed was the flour. He asked what happened. I told him bags had fallen. He checked the shelf, everything was level. He checked the refrigeration controls, no error codes. He asked about the handprint. I told him I didn't know. He wiped it off with a wet rag. I finished the shift. Nothing else happened. When I got home, I watched the video on my phone. Most of it showed exactly what I remembered. Flour falling, me breathing too loudly, the empty space beside the oven. At one point, I could see the powder spreading across that rounded upper section. The camera didn't capture the shape as clearly as I had seen it, but the flour definitely changed direction around something. Near the end of the recording, right before I went outside, the phone was pointed toward the floor. There were tracks in the flour. I could see 2 of them appear. Then, a third. The third one formed less than a foot from my shoe. I first noticed the headlamp while I was boiling water below the north face. It was a little after 4 in the morning, still completely dark, and I was sitting behind a low wall of rocks trying to keep the stove out of the wind. I had spent the night at a rough bivvy spot in the Cairngorms, a few kilometers from the nearest maintained path. I was there to climb a winter line I had done once before with a partner, although this time I was alone. My name was Callum Reed. I was 34 then, lived in Perth, and had been climbing for about 12 years. I wasn't some elite mountaineer. I did a lot of hill days, some winter routes, a bit of ice when conditions were good. I knew enough to turn around when things felt wrong. The weather that morning was actually better than forecast. Cold, maybe -6, with patches of thin cloud moving fast above the ridge. There had been light snow the evening before, not much, just enough to cover old tracks and fill the cracks between rocks. I had checked the slope with my headlamp before starting breakfast. Nothing moved. Then, while I was waiting for the water to boil, I saw a light across the quarry. At first, I was pleased. Seeing another climber around usually made a remote place feel less empty. The light was maybe 500 meters away, possibly more. Distances were hard to judge in darkness. It was on the cliff opposite me, moving slowly from left to right. I assumed somebody was starting an early route. Then I realized where the light actually was. There was no route there, not one I knew anyway. The cliff had a broad section of steep broken rock, then a near vertical wall that rose toward a shoulder below the summit plateau. In summer, you could probably scramble around parts of it if you were reckless enough, but in winter it was covered in thin ice, loose snow, and exposed rock. The headlamp was halfway across that wall. I watched it for about 30 seconds. It moved horizontally, very slowly, then stopped. I remember thinking they must be on a narrow ledge I couldn't see from my angle. I turned my own headlamp off so I could judge the position better. The light across the quarry looked brighter with everything else dark. It was white. No blinking, no second lamp nearby. That was odd too, because most winter climbers weren't soloing unfamiliar cliff faces before dawn. But people did strange things in the mountains. I went back to the stove. A minute later, I looked again. The light was gone. I thought they had turned their head. That happened all the time. If someone looked directly toward a rock face, their lamp disappeared from your view. Then it came back, higher up, much higher, maybe 20 or 30 meters. I actually stood up. There was no obvious line connecting the two positions. To move that far, whoever it was would have needed to climb nearly vertical ground. I checked my watch because I wanted to make sure I hadn't lost track of time while messing with breakfast. 4:16. I had only looked away for maybe 40 seconds. I watched the light continue upward. Not directly upward. It moved diagonally now toward a large, dark section of cliff that I knew was solid rock. It stopped at the edge, then disappeared. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. I started thinking maybe I was seeing a star through gaps in the cloud. That explanation made me feel stupidly relieved. Then the light appeared again on the other side of the rock. Same brightness, same height. It looked like it had passed behind something, except the rock face wasn't a freestanding pillar. There was nothing behind it from where I was sitting. It was the mountain. I took out my map, even though that obviously wasn't going to help. I knew the cliff. I had walked under it before. There were gullies on either side, but no tunnel, no deep notch. Nothing that would let someone disappear behind the visible face and come out a few seconds later. I picked up my binoculars. They were small folding ones, mostly for spotting route conditions. Through them, I could see the lamp better, but not the person. That bothered me immediately. Normally a headlamp lit part of the climber too. Helmet, shoulders, arms, snow around their feet. This one just seemed to be a point of light. There was a faint glow against the rock near it, but I couldn't make out a body. I adjusted the focus. Nothing. The lamp moved again, up maybe a meter. Pause. Up again. The movement didn't look like climbing. It was too smooth. No little side motions, no swinging beam, no searching for holds. It simply shifted. I lowered the binoculars. The stove had gone out. The wind had picked up enough that I hadn't noticed. I relit it and tried to ignore the opposite cliff. I told myself I had come there to climb, not sit around watching somebody else. Then I heard metal. A faint clink from across the quarry. It sounded like climbing gear. A carabiner against rock. That made everything seem normal again. I actually laughed at myself. Of course there was a climber. I was just seeing them from a strange angle. A few seconds later I heard another clink, then another. The spacing was regular. Clink, pause, clink, pause. I frowned because the sound didn't match the light. The lamp was stationary. Then I noticed something else. The sound seemed too close. The cliff was several hundred meters away. A small piece of metal should not have been that clear in the wind. I listened. Clink. This time I looked behind me. Nothing. The noise came again from somewhere to my right. Not across the quarry. I turned my lamp back on and swept it over the rocks around the bivvy. Empty. My pack, ice axe, boot prints, a few snow-covered boulders, nothing else. When I looked back at the cliff, the other light had moved again. It was now near the upper third. That should have taken a climber at least 20 minutes from the previous point, probably much longer. Only a few minutes had passed. I checked my watch, 4:24. I started filming with my phone. The video looked terrible. Mostly black. The headlamp was a tiny white dot that kept losing focus. I zoomed in. On the screen, the light looked elongated, almost vertical. Then the camera tried to refocus and it became a round blur again. I recorded for about a minute. During that minute, it moved upward twice. Each movement happened when the cloud thickened, not when the light disappeared completely. Just when everything darkened slightly, it would be in one place. Cloud passed over the stars. The cliff got darker. Then the light was higher. I stopped filming. I didn't like the pattern. I packed the stove. My original plan had been to leave the bivvy around 5 and reach the base of my route near first light. I decided to start early. Moving felt better than sitting there. My route was on the western side of the quarry, away from the strange light. I strapped my crampons to the outside of my pack and started walking. The snow made everything quieter. After about 5 minutes, I looked over. The headlamp was still there. It seemed to be moving in the same general direction as me, except vertically. Every time I gained a little ground around the quarry, it gained height. I stopped. It stopped. I walked again. A minute later, it moved. I told myself that was coincidence. Then I tested it. I took 10 steps. Stopped. The light moved a few seconds later. I waited a full minute. Nothing. I walked again. The light shifted upward. That was when I decided I wasn't climbing. Not because I thought the light was following me. I wasn't ready to believe that. I just knew I wasn't concentrating properly anymore, and winter climbing alone wasn't the place to be distracted. I turned toward the route I had come in on. That meant crossing the lower quarry again and dropping toward the main path. The safest choice was home. I felt embarrassed, even though nobody was there to judge me. As I started down, the other light disappeared. I kept walking. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard a whistle. One short whistle. I stopped. Mountaineers sometimes whistled to get attention. I looked back. The opposite cliff was dark. I shouted, "You okay?" My voice echoed around the quarry. No answer. Then I heard my own words again. Not the echo. The echo came almost immediately, broken up by the rock. This second sound came maybe 5 seconds later. "You okay?" Same words. Quieter. From higher up. I stood there with my axe in one hand. I shouted, "Hello?" Echo. Then silence. I waited. Nothing repeated it. I kept moving. The path out wasn't really a path at that point, more a known line through boulders and frozen ground. I had my GPS, map, and compass, so navigation wasn't an issue. But my headlamp started dimming. It was a rechargeable Petzl that had been fully charged the night before. The battery indicator still showed more than half. The beam kept fading anyway. Bright. Dim. Bright. I stopped and replaced the battery with a spare. The new one did the same thing. That worried me more than the light on the cliff. Equipment problems in winter could become serious very quickly. I took out my backup torch. That worked normally. When I turned the Petzl off, I saw the other headlamp again. It was no longer on the main face. It was near the ridge, very close to the top. I raised the binoculars, still no climber, but this time I saw something beside the light, a darker patch, long and narrow. It seemed to hang below it. I couldn't make out arms or legs. It might have been a shadow. I lowered the binoculars, wiped the lenses, and checked again. The dark patch was gone. The lamp remained. Then it moved sideways into another section of solid rock and vanished. I waited for it to appear. Nothing. I put the binoculars away. I told myself I was done watching. The sky was beginning to lighten very slightly in the east. Not sunrise yet, just enough to separate the ridges from the sky. I continued down. About 15 minutes later, I reached a shallow snowfield below the cliff. This was one of the reasons I had turned back. The normal route out passed close to the bottom of the face where I had seen the light. I considered going around the opposite way, but that would have added at least 2 hours and crossed worse ground. By then, I could see well enough to switch off my torch. The snowfield was untouched. That was immediately obvious. Fresh snow had fallen the previous evening. My own tracks came in from the south. There were a few hair prints, nothing else. No boot prints, no crampon marks, no slide marks. If someone had approached that cliff from below, they should have crossed the snow. I scanned the whole area. Nothing. I walked closer to the rock. There were old climbing anchors in some of the established routes farther along, but not here. The section where I had watched the lamp was steep and ugly. Loose blocks, thin ice, overhangs. I couldn't even see a realistic starting point. I stood maybe 40 meters out and tried to match the nighttime positions with the daylight face. The first place I had seen the lamp was halfway up a blank slab. There was no ledge. The section where it had disappeared behind rock was one continuous wall. I felt a strange pressure in my ears while I was looking at it. Like altitude change. I swallowed. It went away. Then I heard the clink again. One metal tap from above. I looked up. Nothing. Another tap. This time farther left. I backed away from the cliff. A small stone rolled down. It bounced once and stopped in the snow. That was normal enough. Then another stone landed several meters away. Then another. I moved faster. Loose rock could fall for any number of reasons, especially during freeze and thaw. I didn't wait underneath to find out. I crossed the snowfield and reached the main track around 7. By then, the sun was coming up behind thin cloud. There were other people there. 2 walkers heading in. A guy with a dog. Seeing them helped more than I expected. One of the walkers stopped and asked about conditions higher up. His name was Graham, judging by what his friend called him. I told him there was thin snow and some ice. Then I asked if they had seen anyone ahead of them. He said no. They had started from the car park around 5:30. I asked if they had noticed a headlamp on the north face. Both of them looked toward the mountain. Graham said he had seen a light near the top around 6. His friend said he thought it was a star. I asked where exactly. Graham pointed. It was roughly where I had last seen it. Then he said, "It moved, though." His friend looked at him. Graham shrugged. He said he had watched it for a few seconds from the car park and thought it was somebody descending. That made no sense because from my side it had been ascending. I didn't tell them everything. I just said I hadn't seen any tracks. They continued toward the hills. I walked back to my car. It took another hour. I kept looking behind me whenever I had a clear view of the ridge. No light. No people. Nothing unusual. My car was where I had left it. There were 5 other vehicles in the lot by then. I changed my boots, threw my gear in the back, and sat with the heater running. Before driving away, I checked the video. The first part showed the little white point exactly where I remembered. Near the end, the camera shook as I adjusted my grip. For maybe 2 seconds, the light went out of frame. When I brought it back, there were 2 lights. One was higher, one was lower. I didn't remember seeing 2. I watched again. The lower one stayed still. The upper one moved slightly, then the lower light went out. I checked the timestamp, 4:22. I zoomed in as far as the phone allowed. The image broke into pixels. There wasn't much detail, but around the lower light there seemed to be a pale patch against the rock. Not a person, more like a short vertical mark. I put the phone away. I drove home through Aviemore and stopped for coffee. By the time I got back to Perth, it was early afternoon. I unpacked my wet gear in the hallway and left the crampons in the utility room. Later that evening, I checked them because I wanted to dry the straps properly. There was gray dust packed into the points of the left crampon, fine stone powder. That wasn't especially strange by itself. I had walked over plenty of rock. What caught my attention was a thin, silver-colored shaving stuck under one of the front points. It looked like scraped aluminium. I pulled it free and set it on the worktop. I checked the right crampon. There was another piece. The only metal I had stepped on all day had been my own gear. I looked through the photos I had taken before leaving the quarry. One showed the untouched snow below the cliff. Another showed the rock face in daylight. I zoomed into the second one. High on the wall, near where the headlamp had disappeared for the last time, there was a small bright mark. It looked like metal catching the morning light. I went back through my map and climbing guide. There were no bolts, anchors, or known routes anywhere near that section. I enlarged the photo until it became blurry. The bright mark was still there. Below it, running down the rock for several meters, was a thin gray line that had not been visible when I stood beneath the cliff. It stopped above the untouched snow. The first call came in a little after 10 at night while I was reading the weather. I worked the late shift at a small AM station in western Kansas. The town was called Mercer, and the station sat in a 1-story brick building behind a farm supply store near the highway. We mostly played old country, local ads, weather updates, school sports, church announcements, that kind of thing. At night, I was usually alone. My name was Daniel Cross. I was 38 then, divorced, no kids, and I had been doing radio work for about 14 years. The late shift wasn't exciting, but I liked it. There was less management, fewer people calling in to complain about song choices, and long stretches where I could just cue music and drink bad coffee. That night was clear and cold for early March. The wind had dropped after sunset, which was unusual out there. Most nights you could hear it pushing against the building or rattling the sign over the front entrance. That night, everything outside was still. I had just finished saying the overnight low would be around 26 when line 2 lit up. I answered during a song. The caller was a man named Curtis Halley. I knew the name because he owned a tire shop east of town and called the station sometimes about high school football. He asked if I had heard anything about an aircraft in trouble north of Mercer. I said no. He told me there was something over the fields near County Road 18. I asked what kind of aircraft. He said, "That's the thing. I don't know." I thought he was setting up a joke. Curtis wasn't drunk or excited, though. He sounded confused. He said he was outside checking a frozen water line behind his shop when he noticed 3 white lights sitting low over the horizon. At first, he thought it was a crop duster, except the lights weren't moving. Then they moved sideways altogether. No banking, no change in spacing. He said he watched them for maybe 2 minutes, then went inside to get his wife. When they came back out, the lights were farther west. I asked if he could hear anything. He said no. Then he asked if anyone else had called. I told him he was the first. I wrote "Lights North CR18" on a notepad and went back to work. I didn't think much of it. People called radio stations with strange stuff all the time, especially at night. About 7 minutes later, line 1 rang. This caller was a woman named Marlene Voss. She lived out by Sutton Creek, maybe 15 miles northwest of town. She asked if the sheriff's office had reported anything in the sky. I said not that I knew of. She said she had seen a dark object pass over her pasture. I asked if it had lights. She said only one, a dull red light underneath. She kept saying underneath like that mattered. I asked how high it was. She said lower than a helicopter would normally fly. Then she corrected herself and said she didn't really know because she couldn't tell how big it was. What bothered her was the cattle. She said every cow in the south pasture had crowded against the fence before she noticed the object. They had all been facing the same direction. I asked if they were still doing that. She looked while we were on the phone. Then she went quiet. I asked what was wrong. She said the cattle had turned around. Every one of them was facing east now. I asked if the object was east. She said she couldn't see it anymore. That got my attention a little. I wrote her name under Curtis's. Then I opened a flight tracking website on the studio computer. There were 2 commercial flights way above us, one heading toward Denver and another southeast toward Oklahoma. Nothing low. I knew that didn't prove anything. Small private aircraft didn't always show up. Military traffic could be missing. Agricultural planes sometimes flew at odd hours during certain seasons. Still, March wasn't exactly spraying season. I went outside during the next commercial break. The station parking lot was empty except for my pickup. The sky was very clear. I could see stars all the way down toward the horizon. I didn't see anything unusual. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then heard the song ending through the wall and hurried back inside. At 10:23, a third person called. This was a younger guy named Eli Romero. I didn't know him personally, but he said he was driving south on State Route 7. He asked me if there was a tower being moved. I didn't understand what he meant. He said there was something with red lights crossing the fields to his right, but it looked too wide to be a vehicle. I asked if he had pulled over. He said yes. Then he said, "It just stopped." I waited. For several seconds, I could hear his engine running and the clicking of his hazard lights. Then he whispered, "That's not a tower." The call dropped. I tried calling him back from the station line. No answer. That was when I started thinking about mentioning it on air. Not as a UFO story or anything dramatic, just something like, "We've had a few reports of unusual lights around the northern part of the county, so if you know what they are, give us a call." That seemed harmless. I had about 4 minutes before the current song ended. I pulled a local traffic bed into the playlist and made a note to say something after it. Before I could, the studio phone rang again. Not one of the public lines, the internal phone. That was strange. We had 2 systems. The call-in board had 4 listener lines, and then there was an ordinary desk phone next to the console that was mostly for staff, advertisers, and management. That phone rarely rang after business hours. The display said unavailable. I picked it up. I said, "KMRQ, this is Daniel." There was no response. I thought maybe it was a robocall. Then I heard a hiss, not static exactly, more like room noise. I almost hung up. Then I heard my own voice. It said, "We've had several calls tonight about unusual lights north of town." I stopped breathing for a second. The recording continued. My voice said, "If you're out that way, don't stop on the shoulder. Just keep moving and let us know what you see." Then the line went dead. I sat there holding the receiver. I hadn't said those words. Not yet. I had planned to say something similar, but I hadn't written that exact sentence. The part about not stopping on the shoulder hadn't even occurred to me. I checked the call display again. Unavailable. I pressed redial. Nothing happened. The phone gave me a fast, busy tone. The song had about 40 seconds left. I remember staring at my handwritten note. Mention lights? That was all I had written. I told myself somebody was screwing with me. Maybe Curtis. Maybe one of the station guys had remote access to something. I checked the security camera monitor in the corner. Front entrance empty. Hallway empty. Back door closed. The song ended. The mic light came on, and I said, "We've had several calls tonight about unusual lights north of town." I realized it halfway through the sentence. My stomach dropped, but I kept going. There was dead air otherwise. Then I said, "If you're out that way, don't stop on the shoulder. Just keep moving and let us know what you see." Word for word. I hadn't meant to. I know that sounds impossible, but I didn't make a decision to repeat the recording. The sentence just came out. My mouth got ahead of my brain. The second I finished, I killed the mic and started another song. I sat back from the console. My hands were sweating. I said out loud, "No." The phone rang. Listener line 3. I almost didn't answer. It was Curtis again. He said, "Why'd you tell people not to stop?" I asked what he meant. He said the lights had crossed over the county road. A pickup had stopped near his property. Curtis had watched the whole thing from about half a mile away. He said the lights moved toward the truck. Then the truck backed up fast and left. I asked if he knew who was driving. He said no. Then he asked if I had heard from anyone near Hobart Grain. I said no. Curtis told me to call them. I asked why. He said because whatever it is, it's heading that way. I called the sheriff's office instead. The dispatcher knew me. Her name was Janice Bell. I told her we had several reports of lowlights north and northwest of Mercer. She gave a tired laugh and asked if I was doing one of my late night segments. I said no. Then I asked if deputies had received calls. She paused. She said, "A couple." I asked what kind. She wouldn't give details. She just said there was probably farm equipment moving around and a deputy was checking. I asked if there were aircraft in the area. She said she didn't know. Before hanging up, she said, "Daniel, don't make this bigger on the radio." That surprised me. I asked why. She said because they didn't know what it was yet and didn't want people driving around looking for it. I told her fine. The next 20 minutes were strange but quiet. No more calls, no more internal phone. I played music and read one ad. I didn't mention the lights again. Around 10:50, I started hearing a low tone in my headphones. It wasn't in the music. At first, I thought it was electrical interference. I removed the headphones. The tone continued. It seemed to be coming from the studio monitors. I lowered them. Still there. I muted every audio channel. The sound stayed, a smooth, low hum, not loud, just enough to feel more than hear. Then the fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered. Once, twice. The computer monitor blinked black and came back. The hum stopped. The call board lit up all 4 lines at once. None of them rang. They just lit. I stared at the buttons. Then line 1 went dark, then line 2, then 3. Line 4 stayed lit. I pressed it. Nobody spoke. I could hear wind. That made no sense because the night outside was still. The wind on the line was loud, like a microphone being held out of a moving car. Then a man said something far away. I couldn't make out the words. I said, "Hello?" The wind stopped. The caller whispered, "Look east." The line disconnected. I didn't. Not immediately. I stayed in my chair. Then the security camera over the back entrance changed brightness. The image washed out slightly, like a vehicle had pulled around the building with headlights on. I looked at the front camera. Nothing. Parking lot empty. I got up and walked to the hallway. There was a narrow window in the back door. Through it, I could see the gravel service lot behind the station. There were no headlights, but the ground was brighter than it should have been. A faint gray light covered the lot. It came from above. I stepped closer to the window. I could see the shadow of the building stretching west. That meant the light was east. I remembered what the caller had said. Look east. I didn't want to open the door. I moved into the small production room instead. It had a window facing the farm supply yard and the fields beyond it. I turned off the room light. At first, I saw nothing except reflections. Then I noticed something above the grain silos. It looked like a dark strip against the stars, long and flat. I couldn't judge the distance. It might have been a mile away, it might have been much closer. There were no obvious wings, no clear shape really. Just an area where the stars were blocked. A single dim red light sat underneath it. Marlene's description came back to me immediately. The red light did not blink. The object moved sideways, very slowly. There was no engine noise, no helicopter chop, nothing. I stood there watching for maybe 10 seconds. Then the desk phone rang in the studio. I nearly ignored it. It rang again. I went back. Unavailable. I didn't answer until the fourth ring. My own voice said, "It's over the east side now." I dropped the receiver onto the desk. The recording kept playing through the handset. My voice continued. "It looks like it's moving toward the station." Then silence. I backed away from the desk. The object outside was still visible through the production room window. I could see the dark area sliding past the stars. I decided not to go on air. I deliberately said to myself, I am not saying that. The current song had less than a minute left. I loaded another one immediately. Then another after that. No talking. The object seemed to stop. The low hum returned. This time the window glass vibrated lightly. A coffee stirrer rolled across the desk and fell onto the floor. I checked the security cameras again. The rear camera was full of horizontal lines. The front one still worked. Nothing was there. Then listener line 2 rang. I answered. It was Eli. His voice sounded shaky. He said he had made it home. I asked what happened earlier. He said he had stopped because the lights were low over a field. Then the radio in his truck had started playing his own voice. I asked what he meant. He said he heard himself say, "Drive." Then a few seconds later, he had shouted the word without thinking. He put the truck in gear and left. I asked if he had seen the object clearly. He said no. He said it looked darker than the sky. Then he asked where I was. I told him at the station. He said, "You need to leave." I asked why. There was a pause. Then he said, "Because the thing I saw was going south." The call ended normally. I shut the station down to automation. We had a backup overnight playlist for emergency. I switched it on, grabbed my coat and keys, and left through the front door. The parking lot was cold and completely still. No wind, no traffic on the highway. I didn't look east until I reached my truck. The dark object was farther south now. I could barely see it. The red light was gone. I got inside and started the engine. The radio came on automatically. Static. I turned it off. As I backed out, the station phone rang inside the building. I could hear it faintly through the glass doors. I kept going. The drive home took about 12 minutes. I lived on the west side of Mercer in a small rental house near the water tower. I saw 2 sheriff vehicles heading north as I came into town. Neither had lights or sirens on. I reached my house at 11:31. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a minute. Nothing followed me. The sky looked normal. Inside, I locked the door and called Janice at dispatch. She said deputies had checked several roads but found nothing. I asked if anyone had reported an aircraft. She said no. I asked if the power had flickered at the sheriff's office. There was a pause. Then she said yes, at 11:14. That was around the time I had left the station. I didn't tell her about the phone calls. I slept maybe 3 hours. At 7 the next morning, the station manager, Greg, called me. He wanted to know why I had switched to automation early. I told him there had been electrical problems. That was partly true. He said the overnight system had logged an incoming call at 10:26 from the studio extension. I told him that wasn't possible. He said maybe I had accidentally called myself. I asked him what number showed in the log. He read it to me. It was the station's own studio number, not the internal extension. The public number. The call had come from the same number it was calling, and I drove back to the station around 9. Everything looked normal. Greg was there with the engineer, a guy named Wes. They were checking the phone system. I didn't say much. I went into the studio and looked at the notepad from the night before. My notes were still there. Curtis, Marlene, Eli. Below those, I had written a sentence I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine. It said, "It's over the east side now." Under that was another line. "It looks like it's moving toward the station." I stared at it for a long time. Then Greg called me into the hallway because Wes had found something in the recording archive. The station automatically saved everything that went out over the air. There was an audio file from 10:25. It was 8 seconds long. There should not have been any broadcast audio at that time because a song had been playing. Wes opened the file. There was a little static. Then my voice, very quiet. It said, "Don't mention the reports." 3 seconds later, another voice answered. It sounded like me too. It said, "I wasn't going to." I left the station before lunch and drove home. The first sound came from the far side of the quarry while we were standing completely still. It sounded like Malik dropping the survey pole. That was the problem. Malik was standing 6 feet from me with the pole still in his hand. We all looked across the pit at the same time. There were 4 of us working that day. Me, Malik Bandari, our crew lead Owen Price, and a newer guy named Ben Keller who had only been with the company a couple of months. We were doing a control survey at an old limestone quarry in western Pennsylvania that was being reopened in sections for aggregate work. The quarry sat down inside a ring of wooded ridges with one access road coming in from the south. It wasn't huge, but once you were down on the lower bench, the walls blocked almost everything. No houses, no highway noise unless the wind was right. Cell service came and went. It was late September and unusually warm. The sky was overcast all day, heavy and low, but it never actually rained. Everything had that damp smell like rain was coming. We started around 7 in the morning. By 11, we had worked our way onto the western bench. That section hadn't been actively quarried in years. There were weeds growing through cracks in the haul road and shallow pools of greenish water along the rock face. We were setting points for a future drainage plan. There was a lot of echo in the pit. That wasn't unusual. If someone shouted, you got it back from 2 or 3 directions. Metal clanks carried forever. Even closing a truck door could sound like somebody dropping a dumpster. So when we heard the first bang, Owen immediately said, "Echo." Then Malik lifted the pole slightly and said, "Echo of what?" Nobody answered. The sound we had heard was very specific. The bottom of Malik's pole had a metal point on it. When he lost his grip on it, which happened pretty often, it hit rock with a hollow little clang, then bounced once. That was exactly what we had just heard. Clang. Tap. Except Malik hadn't dropped it yet. Ben laughed and said maybe somebody else was working above us. Owen radioed the site manager. No response. He tried again and got static. There was a loader operating near the entrance, but it was at least half a mile away and down around 2 bends. The only other crew we knew about was drilling on the east side. We waited. Nothing. Malik made a joke about the quarry predicting the future. Then maybe 5 seconds later, while he was adjusting the prism mount, the pole slipped. Clang. Tap. All 4 of us went quiet. It was the same sound. Not similar. The same rhythm. The same little second tap. Ben looked toward the wall. Owen said, "Okay, that was weird." Malik picked the pole up and asked if anyone had recorded the first one. Nobody had. I thought maybe I was fitting the 2 sounds together after the fact. Human brains did that. You heard something vague and then decided later that it matched something else. That explanation worked for about 10 minutes. We moved 50 yards north to set another point. I was carrying the total station tripod. Owen was looking at the data collector. Ben was dragging a fiberglass tape across the ground. Before any of us said anything, a voice came from the quarry wall. It sounded like Owen. Clear enough that I heard the words. "Give me 28.6. Owen looked up. Nobody moved. The words bounced once from the opposite wall and faded. Ben said, "Was that you?" Owen said no. Malik looked at the radio clipped to Owen's vest. The radio was silent. We stood there for several seconds, then Owen checked the collector and walked toward the tape. He squinted at the screen. "Give me 28.6. Nobody laughed that time. I remember watching Ben's face. He had gone pale. Owen stopped mid-step. He looked across the pit, then down at the collector like maybe it had said the words. Malik said, "Nope." That was exactly how he said it. Just one word. Owen told us to stop working for a minute. We walked back toward the truck. The echoes in that place were strange sometimes. We all knew that. Sound could bounce around rock walls in ways that were hard to place. But sound couldn't happen before the thing making it. At least that was what I kept thinking. Owen got the site manager on the radio. He asked if anybody was using a loudspeaker or testing communications somewhere above us. The manager, Rick, sounded confused. He said no. Owen asked if the drilling crew was close to our section. Rick said they had shut down for lunch 15 minutes earlier. We didn't mention what we had heard. Owen just said there was odd noise coming off the west wall. Rick said, "It's a quarry." That pretty much ended the conversation. We ate lunch by the truck. Nothing happened for about half an hour. We started making jokes again. Ben said maybe somebody had hidden speakers in the rocks. Malik said he was going to say tomorrow's lottery numbers and see if the quarry repeated them early. Nobody found that, especially funny. Around noon, we went back to work. The first hour was normal. Then I heard my own drill. We used a small cordless rotary hammer to set control nails in harder sections of rock. I hadn't taken it out of the case yet. I heard it anyway. 3 short bursts. Brr, brr. It came from somewhere above the north wall. I stopped walking. Malik heard it too. He said, "That yours?" I opened the case. The drill was inside. I didn't touch it. Owen looked at